At 40 years old, Clara Whitaker discovered the ranch she'd bled for wasn't hers anymore, and the quiet drifter she'd been feeding breakfast owned it all. For 20 years, she'd risen before dawn to cook for 36 cowboys, signed papers she didn't understand, and watched her father's legacy crumble under debts that multiplied like rattlesnakes. Then Ethan Cross walked through her door with secrets in his silence and ownership papers in his pocket. What happened next would tear apart a corrupt empire, ignite a courtroom war, and force a woman who'd spent half her life surviving to finally fight back. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Clara's fight for justice has traveled. The Texas sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Clara Whitaker's boots hit the kitchen floor. 4:30 a.m., same as every morning for the past 20 years. The floorboards groaned under her weight, not from heaviness, but from age. The entire ranch house was dying by degrees, just like everything else her father had built. Cracked window panes, peeling paint, a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained, which it rarely did anymore. Even the land itself seemed to be giving up, the grass growing thinner each season, the cattle growing leaner, the water in the wells dropping lower and lower. But the kitchen, Clara's domain, remained immaculate. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the efficiency of ritual, lighting the massive cast-iron stove that had belonged to her grandmother. The first flames caught with a whoosh that cut through the silence. Then came the sounds that had defined her adult life. The clang of pots, the sizzle of bacon hitting hot skillets, the rhythmic thud of her knife against the cutting board as she prepped vegetables for the breakfast that would feed 36 hungry men. 36 cowboys who no longer worked for her. The thought settled in her chest like a stone, the way it did every morning. Clara paused, her hand still on the handle of a massive pot, and allowed herself 5 seconds of grief. Just 5. That was all she could afford. Her father, James Whitaker, had built this ranch from nothing. 60,000 acres of Texas scrubland that he'd transformed into profitable cattle country through sheer force of will and backbreaking work. Clara had grown up watching him leave before sunrise and return after sunset, his hands perpetually scarred from barbed wire and hard labor, his face weathered to leather by the relentless sun. "This land is your inheritance," he'd told her on his deathbed 5 years ago, his voice reduced to a whisper by the cancer eating through his lungs. "Don't let anyone take it from you, Clara girl. Promise me." She'd promised, and she'd failed. The 5 seconds ended. Clara straightened her spine and returned to work. By 5:15, the kitchen smelled like heaven: bacon, eggs, biscuits, gravy, and strong coffee that could strip paint. Clara had learned to cook for crowds when she was just 15 years old, taking over when her mother died. 25 years of practice had made her hands quick and her instincts flawless. She could crack 8 eggs simultaneously without getting a single piece of shell in the bowl. She could flip pancakes 3 at a time. She knew exactly how much salt to add to a pot of grits without measuring. Cooking was the one thing in her life she could still control completely. The first cowboys started filtering in around 5:30, their boots loud on the wooden porch. Clara heard the familiar voices before they appeared, rough, tired, commenting on the cold morning air, making crude jokes that would have made her mother blush. "Smells like heaven in here, Miss Clara." That was Tommy Reeves, barely 22, with a baby face and a tendency to eat twice as much as any other man on the ranch. He was always first to the table, always first to compliment her cooking. "Then sit down and eat before it gets cold," Clara replied without turning around. Her tone was brisk, authoritative, the voice of a woman who'd been managing men since she was a teenager. They came in groups after that, filling the long wooden table that dominated the dining hall adjacent to the kitchen. Clara had set places for 36, same as always. Plates stacked high with food, mugs ready for coffee, utensils laid out with military precision. She served them like she always did, efficiently, quietly, accepting their thanks with brief nods. Most of them had worked this ranch for years. She knew their stories, their families, their drinking habits, and their debts. She knew which ones sent money home to their mothers and which ones gambled away their wages in town every Saturday night. But they didn't work for her anymore. They worked for whoever owned the ranch now, some faceless bank in Houston, as far as Clara understood it. The details were fuzzy, buried in legal documents she'd been forced to sign 3 years ago when the debts became impossible to ignore. Her father had made some bad investments before he died. There'd been a drought, cattle prices had dropped. The bank had come calling, and Clara, exhausted, overwhelmed, and alone, had signed whatever they'd put in front of her. Just temporary, the lawyer had assured her, his smile as slick as his suit. Just to restructure the debt. You'll maintain operational control. Operational control? What a joke. She controlled the kitchen. That was it. Everything else, the cattle, the land, the business decisions, belonged to someone else now. She wasn't entirely sure who. The chain of ownership had become so convoluted, so buried in paperwork and legal jargon, that Claire had stopped trying to understand it. All she knew was that she cooked, she cleaned, and she pretended everything was fine. By 6:15, breakfast was done. The Cowboys filed out in the same groups they'd arrived in, heading toward their various assignments for the day. Clara began the process of cleaning up, scraping plates, washing dishes, wiping down surfaces. The work was meditative, allowing her mind to drift. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when she heard the unfamiliar voice. "Smells good." Clara turned sharply, water dripping from her hands. A man stood in the doorway of the kitchen, tall, lean, somewhere in his mid-30s. He wore dusty jeans, a faded gray shirt, and boots that had seen serious miles. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes that were an unsettling shade of pale blue. There was something coiled about him, something that suggested violence held carefully in check. Clara's first instinct was wariness. Strange men didn't just wander into her kitchen. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Ethan Cross." He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile, just stood there watching her with those unnerving eyes. "Looking for work. We're not hiring. I heard you needed hands." "You heard wrong." Ethan's expression didn't change. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away. No irritation, no disappointment, no emotion at all. It was like talking to a stone wall. "Rhett Calder told me to come by," he said quietly. "Said you could use someone who knows cattle." Rhett. Of course, Rhett Calder was the ranch foreman, installed by the bank about 2 years ago. Clara hadn't wanted him. Hadn't been consulted at all, actually. He'd simply shown up one day with papers declaring him the operational manager, and that was that. He was a hard man in his late 40s, with cold eyes and a voice like gravel. The Cowboys respected him out of fear, not loyalty. Clara didn't trust him, never had, but she also didn't have the authority to refuse him. "If Rhett sent you, talk to Rhett," she said, returning to her dishes. "He said to get breakfast first." Clara exhaled slowly through her nose, fighting down her irritation. She turned to face the stranger again. Ethan Cross hadn't moved from the doorway. He stood perfectly still, hands loose at his sides, patient as death itself. "Fine. Whatever." One more mouth to feed wasn't going to make a difference. "Sit," she said curtly, gesturing toward the table. Ethan moved with surprising quietness for a man his size, settling into a chair at the end of the table. Clara fixed him a plate, eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy, and set it in front of him without ceremony. Then she poured him coffee, black and strong. "Thank you, ma'am." His voice was low, respectful. Genuine, Clara thought, though she'd long ago learned not to trust her instincts about men. They'd failed her too many times. She returned to her dishes, acutely aware of the stranger eating behind her. She could hear the quiet clink of his fork against the plate, the soft sound of him chewing. He ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd gone hungry often enough to appreciate food when he had it. "You cook for all the hands?" he asked after a while. "Every morning? Every evening?" "That's a lot of work." Clara shrugged. "It's what I do." "You run the whole kitchen yourself?" "Yes." "No help?" "Don't need help." She could feel him watching her, could sense those pale eyes tracking her movements. It made her skin prickle with unease. She scrubbed a pan harder than necessary, the steel wool rasping against cast iron. "You're Clara Whitaker," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." "This was your father's ranch." Clara's hand stilled. She set the pan down carefully and turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "What do you know about my father?" "Just what people say in town. That he built this place from nothing, that he was a good man." "He was." "I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but there was something in his tone, a weight, a understanding, that made Clara think he'd experienced loss himself. Real loss. Not the empty condolences people offered at funerals while thinking about what to have for dinner. "Thank you," she said quietly. They regarded each other across the kitchen. Clara studied him more carefully now, the way he held himself, the scars on his knuckles, the old burn mark on his forearm partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. This was a man who'd lived a hard life, a man who knew violence intimately. "Why are you really here?" Clara asked. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I told you, looking for work. There are 100 ranches in Texas. Why this one?" "Heard it was a good place." "You heard wrong about that, too." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Ethan's eyes, there and gone so quickly, Clara almost missed it. "I can work cattle, horses, fences, whatever you need," he said. "I don't drink much, don't cause trouble, and I mind my own business." "What's your story?" "Don't have one." "Everyone has a story." "Mine's not interesting." Clara felt her jaw tighten. She didn't like mysteries, didn't like men who showed up out of nowhere with no past and no explanations. But she also knew it wasn't her decision. If Rhett wanted to hire him, he'd be hired. Her opinion didn't matter. "Finish your breakfast," she said, turning back to her dishes. "Then find Rhett. He'll tell you what to do." "Yes, ma'am." They didn't speak again. Ethan finished his meal in silence, brought his plate to the sink, thanked Clara quietly, and left. She watched him go through the window, tall, lean, moving with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Something about him unsettled her deeply. The day unfolded with its usual rhythms. Clara cleaned the kitchen, prepped ingredients for the evening meal, made a shopping list of supplies they were running low on. Around 10 a.m., she walked to the small office her father had used, now Rhett's domain, to discuss the grocery order. The office was in the main barn, a cramped space that smelled of leather, hay, and old paper. Rhett sat behind the desk that had once belonged to Clara's father, his boots propped up on the scarred wood surface, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with iron gray hair and a face that had been hard even when he was young. He looked at Clara the way most men looked at furniture, aware of her presence but utterly indifferent to it. "What?" he asked without preamble. Clara set her list on the desk. "Need to make a supply run. We're low on flour, sugar, coffee, and about a dozen other things." Rhett picked up this list, his eyes scanning it with obvious irritation. "This is a lot of money," he said. "It's what I need to feed your men." "The bank's been asking questions about expenses. Then the bank can come here and cook breakfast themselves." Rhett's eyes narrowed. He took a long drag from his cigarette, then exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "Watch your mouth, Clara." "I'm just stating facts." "You're stating opinions. There's a difference." Clara bit back the retort forming on her tongue. Fighting with Rhett never accomplished anything except making her life harder. He had the power here, not her. The bank's backing, the legal authority, the control. All she had was a kitchen and a lot of bitter experience. "I'll cut what I can," she said tightly. "But we need the basics." "Make it work with half." "Half won't, half. Figure it out." Rhett tossed the list back across the desk. Clara picked it up, her hands steady despite the anger burning in her chest. "Anything else?" Rhett asked, already returning his attention to the papers spread across the desk. "You hired someone new, Ethan Cross." "So? Where'd he come from? Why do you care?" "I like to know who's eating my food." Rhett's laugh was short and ugly. "Your food? That's cute, Clara, real cute." The words landed like a slap. Clara felt her face flush, but she kept her expression neutral. Never let them see you bleed. That was a lesson she'd learned young. "Just curious," she said evenly. "Cross came with references. Good ones. We need hands, so I hired him. End of story." "References from where?" "Why are you asking so many questions?" "Why won't you answer them?" Rhett's expression went cold. He swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward, crushing his cigarette in the ashtray with deliberate force. "Let me make something real clear," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You work here. You don't make decisions. You don't ask questions. You cook, you clean, and you keep your mouth shut. Understand? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't look away. Understand? Rhett repeated. Yes. Good. Now get out of my office. Clara turned and left, her spine rigid with suppressed fury. She made it halfway back to the house before her hands started shaking. 40 years old, half her life spent on this ranch. Her father's legacy, her mother's memory, her entire childhood embedded in this land. And she'd been reduced to the cook. Someone who wasn't allowed to ask questions or have opinions or make decisions. Someone who didn't matter. She stopped walking and closed her eyes, breathing deeply, fighting for composure. The morning sun was already hot on her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear cattle lowing, the shouts of cowboys working the herd, the familiar sounds of a working ranch. Her ranch. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. When Clara opened her eyes, she saw Ethan Cross standing by the corral, watching a young horse test the fence line. He stood perfectly still, his attention entirely on the animal, his posture relaxed but alert. As if sensing her gaze, he turned and looked directly at her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across 50 yards of dusty ground. Then Ethan touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement and returned his attention to the horse. Clara shivered despite the heat. Why? The days that followed fell into a familiar pattern, but with an unfamiliar undercurrent. Ethan Cross became part of the ranch's rhythm, working cattle, mending fences, handling horses with a quiet competence that even Rhett couldn't criticize. The other cowboys accepted him quickly, drawn by his willingness to take the hardest jobs without complaint. Clara watched him from her kitchen window, unable to shake her unease. He was always there, always watching. Not obviously, not in a way that seemed threatening, but his eyes tracked everything, the movement of cattle, the behavior of the other men, the comings and goings of vehicles. He noticed things, remembered things, and he was always polite to Clara, respectful. He thanked her for every meal, asked permission before entering the kitchen, never made the crude jokes or inappropriate comments that some of the younger cowboys thought were funny. It made her more suspicious, not less. Men who were that careful usually had something to hide. 2 weeks after Ethan's arrival, Clara noticed the first discrepancy. She kept meticulous records of the ranch's food supplies. What came in, what went out, how much everything cost. It was the one area where she still had some semblance of control, the one place where her father's training and careful accounting still mattered. The numbers weren't adding up. She stood in the pantry, staring at her ledger, recounting the bags of flour for the third time. According to her records, there should be 8 bags. There were 5. 3 bags of flour didn't just disappear. Clara checked the delivery invoices, checked her own notes, checked everything twice. The numbers didn't lie. 3 bags were missing, not used, missing. And it wasn't just flour, coffee, sugar, canned goods, all coming up short. Someone was stealing from the ranch, or someone was doctoring the invoices. Clara's mind immediately went to Rhett. He controlled the ordering, the deliveries, the payments. It would be easy for him to skim off the top, to pocket the difference between what the bank thought was being spent and what was actually arriving. But she had no proof. Just missing supplies and a growing sense that something was very wrong. She was still standing in the pantry, her ledger open in her hands, when she heard the kitchen door open. Clara turned to find Ethan Cross standing there, his hat in his hands. "Miss Clara," he said quietly, "got a minute?" "I'm busy." "I can see that. This won't take long." Clara hesitated, then nodded. She closed the ledger and followed him out of the pantry, acutely aware that they were alone in the house. The cowboys were all out on the range. Rhett was in town. It was just her and this stranger with the too careful manners and the watchful eyes. "What do you need?" she asked, keeping her voice businesslike. Ethan glanced toward the windows, as if checking to make sure they weren't being observed. Then he looked back at Clara, his expression serious. "How well do you trust Rhett Calder?" The question caught her completely off guard. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. "What kind of question is that?" "A straightforward one." "Why are you asking?" "Because something's wrong here, and I think you know it." Clara's heart began to pound. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive gesture she recognized even as she made it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know anything about this ranch. I know when numbers don't match. I know when supplies go missing. I know when men are being cheated out of wages they've earned. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. What? Ethan's expression softened slightly. You didn't know about the wages. What about the wages? He hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell her. Then he seemed to come to a decision. The men are supposed to be paid on the 1st and 15th of every month. They haven't received full wages in 6 months. Rhett tells them the bank is holding back funds temporarily, tells them to be patient. That can't be right. It's right. I've talked to them. Clara's mind reeled. She knew the men's wages were handled by Rhett, knew the bank transferred funds directly to him for payroll, but she'd assumed everything was being done properly, legally. Why would they stay if they're not being paid, she asked. Because they've got families to feed and nowhere else to go. Because Rhett promises them the back pay is coming. Because they're desperate enough to believe him. How do you know all this? I pay attention. Clara studied him, trying to understand what game he was playing. Why are you telling me? Because you're the only person on this ranch who isn't either corrupt or scared. And because I think you care about what happens to these men. I'm just the cook. You're James Whitaker's daughter. This is your ranch. Not anymore. Is that what you believe? Or is that what Rhett's convinced you to believe? The question hit like a physical blow. Claire took a step back, her breathing suddenly unsteady. You need to leave, she said. Miss Clara, get out of my kitchen. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face. Then he nodded slowly, placed his hat back on his head, and left without another word. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands trembling, her mind spinning. What the hell was happening to her ranch? She couldn't sleep that night. Clara lay in her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, the same room she'd slept in since she was 15, and stared at the ceiling. Shadows from the moon painted strange patterns across the cracked plaster. Ethan's words kept circling through her mind. The men are being cheated. Supplies are disappearing. You're the only person who isn't corrupt or scared. Was he telling the truth? Or was this some kind of game, some manipulation she couldn't see yet? Clara had learned not to trust easily. Men lied. They always lied, especially to women they thought were weak or desperate or alone. She'd been lied to by lawyers, bankers, her father's so-called friends, even some of the Cowboys who'd sworn loyalty to the Whitaker name. But something about Ethan felt different. He didn't act like a man with something to gain. He didn't flirt, didn't manipulate, didn't make promises. He just watched and waited, which was somehow more unsettling than obvious deception. Around 2 a.m., Clara gave up on sleep. She slipped out of bed, pulled on her robe, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The house was silent except for the settling sounds of old wood, the distant howl of a coyote somewhere on the range. She made herself tea, chamomile, which her mother had always said was good for nerves, and sat at the small table where she did her record keeping. The ledger lay where she'd left it, open to the page showing the missing supplies. Clara ran her finger down the columns of numbers. Flour, coffee, sugar, canned goods. All short, all unexplained. Then she pulled out the payroll records, the ones Rhett gave her each month so she could track household expenses against wages. She'd never examined them closely before, just filed them away like she was supposed to. Now she looked at them with new eyes. The numbers were there, wages paid, amounts listed, everything seemingly in order. Except, Clara frowned, pulling the records closer to the lamp. The amounts were listed, yes, but there were no signatures. No confirmations from the men that they'd actually received the money. Just Rhett's word that payments had been made. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. For the next 2 hours, Clara went through every financial record she had access to. Invoices, receipts, payroll documents, supply orders. She cross-referenced numbers, checked dates, looked for patterns. And she found them. Discrepancies everywhere. Small amounts, carefully hidden, but consistent. Supplies ordered, but never fully delivered. Wages listed, but potentially never paid. Expenses claimed for equipment that she'd never seen arrive. It was a beautiful scam, really. Subtle enough that no single transaction would raise flags. But over months and years, it added up to tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe hundreds of thousands. Money that should have been going to the ranch's operations, Money that was going somewhere else instead. To Rhett? To the bank? To someone else entirely? Clara sat back in her chair, her tea long gone cold, and felt the weight of understanding settle on her shoulders. Her ranch wasn't dying from bad luck or market forces. It was being bled dry deliberately, systematically, by people who thought she was too ignorant or too weak to notice. The anger that rose in her chest was white-hot and purifying. For years, she'd accepted her diminished role, accepted being dismissed as just the cook, accepted signing papers she didn't understand and following orders from men who treated her like furniture. No more. She was 40 years old. She'd survived losing both parents, weathered a drought that killed half the region's cattle, held this ranch together through sheer force of will when everyone said it was impossible. She'd been made to feel small, powerless, irrelevant. But she wasn't. She never had been. Clara Whitaker was James Whitaker's daughter, and it was time she started acting like it. As dawn broke across the Texas sky, painting it in shades of gold and crimson, Clara made herself a promise. She would find out who was stealing from her ranch. She would gather proof, and she would burn their entire operation to the ground, no matter what it cost her. She was done being invisible. Dead. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days after her sleepless night, Rhett announced he was driving to Houston for meetings with the bank. He'd be gone for 4 days, long enough for Clara to do some investigating without him breathing down her neck. She waited until his truck disappeared down the long driveway, dust billowing behind it. Then she walked calmly to the office in the barn. The door was locked, of course. But Clara had grown up on this ranch. She knew where her father had hidden the spare keys in a hollow fence post near the barn's north entrance. Rhett probably didn't even know they existed. The office looked the same as always, cluttered desk, filing cabinets, papers everywhere. But now Clara saw it through different eyes. This wasn't just administrative chaos. This was camouflage, a mess designed to hide the important documents in plain sight. She started with the filing cabinets, working methodically through drawer after drawer. Contracts, invoices, personnel files, tax documents. It was tedious work, made harder by the fact that she had to be careful not to disturb anything too obviously. 2 hours in, she found the first smoking gun. It was a contract between the ranch and a cattle buyer in Amarillo. According to the document, the ranch had sold 200 head of cattle for a specific price per pound. Clara did the math quickly in her head. It should have brought in about $60,000. But when she found the corresponding bank deposit slip, the amount was only $45,000. $15,000 had vanished between the sale and the deposit. Clara's hand shook as she photographed the documents with her phone. She'd started carrying it everywhere now, knowing she needed evidence. Proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She kept searching. By the time the sun began to set, Clara had found 14 separate instances of money disappearing. Cattle sales with incomplete deposits. Supply invoices that didn't match delivery records. Equipment purchases that the ranch had never received. The pattern was clear. Money came in, but only a portion of it went where it was supposed to. The rest evaporated into thin air, or more likely, into someone's pocket. Clara was sitting at Rhett's desk, her phone full of incriminating photos, when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to find Ethan Cross standing in the doorway. Her heart lurched into her throat. For a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't think. She'd been caught red-handed, going through Rhett's files. If Ethan reported this to Rhett when he returned, but Ethan didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. As if this was exactly what he'd expected to find. "How much have you discovered?" he asked quietly. Clara's mind raced. Deny everything? Make an excuse? Run? No, she was done running. "Enough," she said, lifting her chin. "Enough to know this ranch is being robbed blind." Ethan nodded slowly. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said. "You knew?" "I suspected. Now I know." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I needed to be sure, and because I needed to know if you'd figure it out yourself." Clara felt a flash of anger. This was some kind of test? No, this was me trying to understand who I could trust. "You don't know me. I know enough." They stared at each other across the cluttered office. Outside, Clara could hear the evening sounds of the ranch, cowboys returning from the day's work, horses being unsaddled, the dinner bell that someone else must have rung in her absence. "What do you want?" Clara asked. Ethan moved closer, his expression serious. "The same thing you do. The truth." "Why? Why do you care about this ranch?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, with what seemed like great reluctance, he said, "Because it's mine." The words didn't make sense at first. Clara heard them, but couldn't process them. They just hung in the air, meaningless. "What?" "The ranch," Ethan said quietly. "Legally, it belongs to me, has for about 8 months now." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "That's not possible." "I bought the debt from the bank. Went through 3 intermediary companies to keep my name off the paperwork. As far as the county records show, the ranch belongs to High Point Holdings, LLC, but High Point is mine." "You're lying." "I'm not." Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He laid it on the desk between them. Clara stared at it like it might bite her. "Go ahead," Ethan said. "Read it." With trembling hands, Clara picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a deed. A legal transfer of property ownership from the bank to High Point Holdings, LLC, dated 8 months ago, notarized, legal, real. "I don't understand," Clara whispered. "Your father made some bad investments before he died. The ranch was leveraged to the hilt. When the drought hit and cattle prices dropped, the debt became unsustainable. The bank was going to foreclose, sell the land to developers. It would have been broken up, turned into subdivisions." "So you bought it? Why?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I owed your father a debt." "You never met my father." "Yes, I did. 15 years ago. I was 20, broke, and running from some people who wanted me dead. Your father gave me work, didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just gave me a chance when I needed it most. I worked here for 6 months, then moved on, but I never forgot the kindness he showed me." Clara's mind was spinning. She tried to remember 15 years ago, tried to recall a young cowboy who might have been Ethan. But so many men had worked the ranch over the years, and she'd been dealing with her own grief over her mother's death. "When I heard the ranch was in trouble," Ethan continued, "I decided to help. I had the money by then. Made some good investments, got lucky a few times. I bought the debt to keep the land intact, to give you a chance to save it." "By lying to me?" "By protecting you." "I don't need protection." "Yes, you do, because Rhett Calder isn't just skimming money. He's running a full-scale criminal operation, and if he finds out you're investigating him, you become a liability. Liabilities have a way of disappearing in this part of Texas." The word sent ice through Clara's veins. "You think he'd hurt me?" "I think he'd do whatever's necessary to protect his operation. And I think you've already made yourself a target by being too smart for your own good." Clara sank into Rhett's chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. Everything she'd believed about her life, her ranch, her situation, all of it was wrong. She wasn't the owner. She was barely even the cook. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, moved around by men who thought they knew better than her. And the quiet drifter she'd been feeding breakfast owned everything she'd been fighting to save. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I needed to understand the situation first, needed to see who was loyal and who was corrupt, needed to figure out how deep this goes. And now? Now we have a decision to make." "We?" Ethan crouched down so he was at eye level with her, his pale blue eyes intense. "You can walk away," he said quietly. "I'll understand if you do. This is my problem now, legally. You don't have to be involved. This is my father's ranch. Not anymore. Not legally. It will always be his ranch. Legacy isn't about paperwork." Something that might have been respect flickered across Ethan's face. "Then here's the situation. Rhett's been stealing for at least 2 years, probably longer. He's got help. I don't know who yet, but someone's feeding him information from the bank. They've taken hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. What are you going to do?" "Expose him. Tear apart his operation. Get justice for the men he's been cheating and the ranch he's been bleeding dry." "How?" "Carefully, methodically, with evidence that can't be disputed." Clara looked at the document still clutched in her hands, the deed that said this stranger owned her entire world. She should have been angry, should have felt betrayed, violated, furious. Instead, she felt something unexpected, relief, because for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't alone. "I want to help," she said. "Clara, don't Clara me. This is my fight as much as yours. More, actually. I've been living this nightmare for years while you were off making your investments and getting lucky. You don't get to ride in and save the day without me." Ethan's expression was unreadable. "It's going to be dangerous." "I don't care. Rhett will come after you." "Let him try." They regarded each other in the fading light. Outside, someone called for Clara, asking about dinner. The normal rhythms of the ranch continued, unaware that everything was about to change. "Okay," Ethan said finally. "We do this together, but we do it my way, carefully. No unnecessary risks." "Agreed. And if I tell you to walk away, you walk away. No arguments." "We'll see about that." Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. "You're stubborn." "It's a family trait." He stood, offering her his hand. Clara took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His grip was strong, calloused, steady. "We should get you to the kitchen before people start wondering where you are," Ethan said. "Right. Dinner." Clara moved to the door, then paused and looked back at him. "Why did you really come here?" she asked. "The truth." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father told me once that land has memory, that it remembers the people who loved it and the blood they shed for it. He said this ranch would outlive him, outlive you, outlive everyone, but only if someone was willing to fight for it when it mattered most." "And you think that's you?" "I think it's both of us." Clara nodded slowly. Then she left the office and walked back to the house, her mind already working on the next steps. Behind her, she knew Ethan was carefully returning everything to exactly how they'd found it, erasing all evidence of their search. They were partners now, whether she liked it or not, and together they were going to bring down Rhett Calder's empire, no matter what it took. The war for the Whitaker Ranch had officially begun. The next morning, Clara stood at her stove preparing breakfast with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling. She cracked eggs with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere, replaying Ethan's revelation, processing the implications, trying to understand how her entire world had shifted in a single conversation. The ranch belonged to him. Had belonged to him for 8 months, while she'd believed herself to be nothing more than a glorified servant in her father's house. The humiliation burned hotter than the flames beneath her skillets. But beneath the humiliation was something else, something harder and colder. Determination. The kitchen door swung open and Tommy Reeves ambled in, his boyish face breaking into its usual grin. "Morning, Miss Clara. Smells like heaven, as always." "Morning, Tommy." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Take a seat. Food's almost ready." The Cowboys filtered in as they always did, filling the dining hall with their rough voices and easy laughter. Clara served them with her usual efficiency, but her attention kept drifting to the doorway, waiting. Ethan arrived last, as he had every morning since he'd come to the ranch. He nodded to her respectfully, took his seat at the far end of the table, and accepted his plate with a quiet thank you. To anyone watching, nothing had changed between them, but Clara felt the shift like electricity in the air. They were conspirators now, partners in whatever came next. She was refilling coffee cups when she heard the conversation shift. "Anyone heard when Rhett's getting back?" one of the older hands asked. "Thursday, I think," another replied. "Said he had meetings with the bank." "Bank's always got meetings. Meanwhile, we're still waiting on last month's pay." The comment was casual, almost offhand, but Clara saw several men exchange glances. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the youngest Cowboys, the ones who usually joked their way through breakfast, went quiet. "It'll come," someone said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Sure it will, just like it came last month, and the month before that." "Watch your mouth, Davis. Rhett hears you talking like that." "Rhett ain't here, and I'm getting tired of being told to be patient while my kids are eating beans for dinner because I can't send money home." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Clara glanced at Ethan and found him watching the exchange with careful attention, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "We all got families," Tommy said. his usual cheerfulness replaced by something harder. We all got bills, but what are we supposed to do? Jobs ain't exactly growing on trees out here. Could find work on the Morrison spread. Heard they're hiring. Morrison pays half what we're supposed to be making here. Even with the missing wages, we're better off staying put. Are we? Or are we just afraid to leave? The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her chest tighten. These were good men, hardworking, loyal, the kind of hands her father had valued above everything. And they were being systematically cheated, ground down by desperation and fear. Eat your breakfast, she said quietly, moving through the room with the coffee pot. Fighting amongst yourselves won't solve anything. The men subsided, returning to their food with the sullen silence of people who knew she was right but hated the truth of it. Clara finished her rounds and retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing. Ethan followed her a few minutes later, carrying his empty plate to the sink. "You heard that?" he asked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the dining hall. "Hard to miss. It's getting worse. They're starting to break." Clara scrubbed at a pan with more force than necessary. How long before someone does something stupid? Not long. Men have limits. They're reaching theirs. And if they confront Rhett when he gets back, then people get hurt. Rhett doesn't strike me as someone who handles confrontation well. Clara set the pan down and turned to face him. In the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, Ethan's face was all hard angles and shadows. There was something ancient in his eyes, something that spoke of violence witnessed and survived. "What do we do?" she asked. "We move faster than I'd planned. Rhett's gone for 3 more days. That gives us a window." "To do what?" "Gather evidence, real evidence, the kind that holds up in court. Bank statements, contracts, delivery records. Everything we can find that proves he's been stealing. I've already been through his office once. There's a lot there, but it's a mess. It could take weeks to sort through all of it." "Then we don't do it alone. We get help." Clara frowned. "From who?" "Everyone on this ranch either works for Rhett or is too scared of him to cross him." Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, "Not everyone. There's a lawyer in town, Sarah Chen. She handles property disputes, contract law. Your father used her a few times for land deals." The name rang a bell in Clara's memory. A sharp woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Clara had met her once or twice at community events, but they'd never had reason to work together. "You think she'd help us?" "I think she'd help you. This is still your father's ranch in everyone's eyes. His reputation still means something in this county." Clara felt a surge of hope followed immediately by doubt. What if she's in on it? What if Rhett has her in his pocket? "It's a risk," Ethan admitted. "But we need someone who understands the law, someone who can tell us what evidence we need and how to present it. Otherwise, we're just stumbling around in the dark." He was right. Clara hated that he was right, hated being dependent on anyone else's expertise or goodwill, but hating it didn't change the reality. "Okay," she said. "I'll call her today. Be careful what you say over the phone. Just ask for a meeting. Tell her it's about your father's estate. Don't mention Rhett or the investigation." Clara nodded, then hesitated. "Ethan, if this goes wrong, if Rhett finds out what we're doing," "He won't. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise that if he does find out, he'll have to go through me to get to you." The words were simple, stated as plain fact rather than bravado. But there was something in the way he said them, something absolute, that made Clara believe him. This was a man who knew how to protect what he'd claimed as his own. Whether that made her feel safer or more trapped, she couldn't quite decide. The Cowboys finished breakfast and headed out to their day's work, leaving Clara alone with a mountain of dishes and her churning thoughts. She worked mechanically, her mind already composing what she'd say to Sarah Chen, how she'd navigate a conversation that could make or break everything. She was elbow-deep in sudsy water when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Clara's heart jumped into her throat. Rhett wasn't supposed to be back for 3 more days. But when she moved to the window, she saw an unfamiliar white sedan pulling up to the house. Not Rhett's truck. A man emerged from the driver's side, mid-50s, soft around the middle, wearing an expensive suit that was completely inappropriate for a working ranch. He carried a briefcase and moved with the careful steps of someone unused to uneven ground. Clara dried her hands and met him at the door. "Can I help you?" The man looked up at her with the expression of someone who'd been expecting to find someone else. His smile was professional, but didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitaker?" "Miss, and yes. Gerald Hartman. I'm with Consolidated Agricultural Holdings. We've been in contact with Mr. Calder about some business matters regarding the ranch." Every instinct Clara possessed started screaming warnings. She kept her expression neutral, her voice polite. "Mr. Calder isn't here right now. He's in Houston on business." "Oh, I'm aware. Actually, that's why I'm here. Mr. Calder suggested I speak with you directly about some paperwork that needs to be filed." "What kind of paperwork?" Hartman's smile widened slightly. "Just routine transfer documents. Nothing to worry about. May I come in? This will only take a moment." Every fiber of Clara's being wanted to slam the door in his face. But she'd spent 40 years learning to hide her feelings, learning to play the part expected of her. She stepped aside and gestured him into the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Clara poured him a cup while Hartman settled himself at her work table, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a sheaf of papers and arranged them with the care of a card dealer setting up a game. "Now then," he said, accepting the coffee with a nod. "As I mentioned, these are just routine documents. The bank has restructured some of the ranch's debt, and we need your signature to finalize the new terms." Clara sat down across from him, not touching the papers. "What new terms?" "Oh, just technical adjustments, interest rates, payment schedules, that sort of thing. All very standard. I'd like to read through them first." Hartman's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Though I should mention, there is a bit of a time constraint. The new terms are contingent on filing these documents with the county clerk by the end of this week. If we miss that deadline, the favorable interest rates revert to the previous, much higher, rates. It was a beautiful trap. Create urgency, imply consequences, make her feel like refusing would be irresponsible. How many times had she fallen for this exact tactic over the past 3 years? But Clara had spent a sleepless night going through financial records. She'd seen the pattern of small deceptions that added up to massive theft. And she'd be damned if she signed another piece of paper without understanding exactly what it said. "I'll need to have my lawyer review these," she said calmly. Hartman's smile vanished entirely. "Miss Whitaker, as I explained, we're working on a very tight timeline. Then you should have brought them to me sooner. I don't sign legal documents without proper review. Not anymore. This is highly irregular. Mr. Calder assured us you'd be cooperative." "Mr. Calder doesn't speak for me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Hartman studied her with eyes that had gone flat and calculating. "I see," he said slowly. "May I ask what's prompted this sudden caution?" "It's not sudden. It's overdue. Has someone been giving you advice, making you suspicious of routine business practices?" Clara felt a chill run down her spine. There was a threat in that question, thinly veiled but unmistakable. "I don't need anyone to tell me to read before I sign," she said, keeping her voice steady. "That's just common sense." "Of course." Hartman began gathering his papers with sharp, angry movements. "I'll inform the bank that you've declined to cooperate. They'll be disappointed." "They'll survive." Hartman stood, snapping his briefcase shut with unnecessary force. "You're making a mistake, Miss Whitaker. These debt restructures don't come around often. If you pass on this opportunity, the bank may not be so generous in the future." "I'll take that chance." He stared at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something ugly flicker across his face. Then the professional mask slid back into place. "I'll be in touch," he said, moving toward the door. "I'm sure you will." Clara walked him out, watched him climb back into his sedan, and didn't allow herself to breathe normally until he disappeared down the long driveway in a cloud of dust. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them flat against the kitchen counter, fighting for composure. What the hell had that been about? Routine paperwork? Not a chance. That man had been trying to get her to sign something important enough to send him all the way out here while Rhett was conveniently away in Houston. She needed to talk to Ethan, now. Clara found him near the north pasture, working on a section of fence that had started to sag. He was alone, which was fortunate. She didn't want an audience for this conversation. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Ethan straightened, reading the tension in her voice immediately. What happened? Clara told him about Hartman's visit, about the papers she'd refused to sign, about the barely concealed threats. Ethan's expression grew darker with every word. "Did you get his card?" he asked when she finished. "No, he didn't offer one." "What did the papers look like? Did you see any letterhead?" "Consolidated Agricultural Holdings. That was the company name he gave me." Ethan pulled out his phone and typed rapidly. His frown deepened as he read whatever came up on the screen. "That's a shell company," he said. "Registered in Delaware 3 months ago. No physical address, no actual business operations. It exists on paper and nowhere else." Clara's stomach twisted. What does that mean? It means someone's trying to transfer ownership of something through a fake corporation. If you'd signed those papers, you probably would have signed away what little legal claim you have left to this property. "But I don't own the property. You do." "Legally, yes, but you still have certain rights as your father's heir. There are claims you could make, challenges you could raise. Those papers were probably designed to eliminate those options. Rhett's behind this. Rhett, or whoever's pulling his strings. Either way, you refusing to sign just painted a target on your back." Clara had already figured that much out. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the midday heat. "What do we do?" "We accelerate the timeline. No more waiting. We gather what evidence we can in the next 2 days, and then we go to the authorities before Rhett gets back. The local sheriff is useless. He and Rhett drink together every Friday night. Then we go over his head. County prosecutor. State attorney general if we have to, but we can't wait any longer. They're making their move. We need to make ours." Clara nodded, trying to ignore the fear crawling up her spine. She'd spent most of her adult life trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep her head down and survive. Now she was walking straight into a war. "I'll call the lawyer," she said. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow if she's available." "Good. And Clara?" Ethan's voice softened slightly. "You did the right thing, not signing those papers. A lot of people would have caved under that kind of pressure." "I've caved plenty of times before." "But not this time. That's what matters." She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel proud of herself for standing firm, but all she felt was tired and scared and so very alone, even standing next to someone who claimed to be on her side. Clara returned to the house and made the call to Sarah Chen. The lawyer's receptionist was briskly professional, saying Miss Chen was booked solid for the week. But when Clara mentioned James Whitaker's name, there was a pause. "Let me check with Ms. Chen directly," the receptionist said. 5 minutes later, Clara had an appointment for the following afternoon. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cooking, cleaning, and trying to act normal while her mind spun with possibilities and fears. The Cowboys came in for their evening meal, ate, and dispersed into the twilight. Clara cleaned up mechanically, her body going through motions it had performed 10,000 times while her thoughts were elsewhere. She was wiping down the last of the counters when Ethan appeared in the doorway, a folder tucked under his arm. "Got something," he said quietly. "You need to see this." They sat at her work table, the same table where Hartman had tried to manipulate her just hours earlier. Ethan spread out a series of documents, contracts, invoices, bank statements. Clara recognized some of them from her own investigation. "I've been cross-referencing the cattle sales against the deposit records," Ethan explained. "Look at this one. 3 months ago, the ranch sold 400 head to a buyer in Oklahoma. The contract says they paid $50 per hundredweight." Clara did the quick math. "That should be around $200,000, give or take." "Right. But look at the deposit slip." She examined the paper he pushed across the table. The deposit was for $120,000. $80,000 missing, she breathed. And that's just one sale. I found 6 others with similar discrepancies over the past year. We're talking about over $500,000 that should have gone to the ranch but disappeared somewhere between the buyer and the bank. Clara felt dizzy. $500,000. That kind of money could have saved the ranch, could have paid the Cowboys their full wages, could have made all the difference in the world. Instead, it had vanished into someone's pockets. "Where's it going?" she asked. "That's what I can't figure out. The deposit slips show the money going into the ranch's operating account, but at a much lower amount than the contracts specify. Someone's intercepting the difference. Rhett? Has to be. He handles all the cattle sales, all the financial transactions, but he couldn't do this alone. Someone at the bank has to be helping him, falsifying records, creating fake deposit slips, covering the trail. Clara thought about the monthly statements she received, the ones that always seemed to show just enough money to keep operating, but never enough to get ahead. She'd thought it was just the reality of a struggling ranch, but it had been deliberate sabotage all along. We need to find out who at the bank is involved, she said. Sarah Chen might be able to help with that. She'll know how to request the right records, how to spot the inconsistencies. They spent the next 2 hours going through every document Ethan had compiled, looking for patterns, making notes, building the case piece by piece. It was tedious, exhausting work. But with each new piece of evidence, Clara felt something shifting inside her. The helplessness she'd carried for so long was transforming into something harder, something dangerous. She was done being a victim. Around midnight, they finally called it quits. Ethan gathered the documents carefully, returning them to their folder. "Where are you keeping all this?" Clara asked. "Someplace safe. Someplace Rhett won't think to look." "Which is where?" Ethan hesitated, then seemed to decide trust went both ways. "There's a hollow in one of the oak trees out past the south pasture. Your father showed it to me years ago. Said he used to hide there as a kid when he wanted to get away from his own father." Clara felt her throat tighten. She remembered that tree, remembered her father mentioning it once or twice. The fact that he'd shared that secret with Ethan, even 15 years ago, said something about the trust between them. "He must have really liked you," she said quietly. "He was kind to me when I needed it most. That's more than most people have ever been." There was a weight in those words, a history Clara didn't fully understand. She wanted to ask about Ethan's past, about what had driven him to her father's ranch all those years ago, about the people he'd been running from, but his expression had closed off, gone distant. "Get some sleep," he said, standing. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Ethan?" Clara stood as well, uncertain what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. "Thank you for all of this. For helping." "It's my ranch too," he replied. "Or did you forget?" There was the faintest hint of humor in his tone, so subtle she almost missed it. Clara found herself almost smiling despite everything. "Hard to forget when you keep reminding me. Get used to it. We're in this together now." He left, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch light. Clara locked the door behind him and made her way to her small bedroom, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. But sleep didn't come easy. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. Hartman's visit, the evidence Ethan had compiled, the meeting with Sarah Chen tomorrow. Each piece was a step closer to the truth, but also a step deeper into danger. Somewhere out there, Rhett was in Houston, completely unaware that his carefully constructed empire was about to come crashing down. Or maybe he knew. Maybe Hartman had already called him, warned him that Clara was no longer cooperating. Maybe Rhett was already planning his response. The thought made Clara's skin crawl. She'd seen Rhett angry before, seen the way his eyes went flat and cold, the way his hands would curl into fists. He was a man who solved problems with force, not negotiation. If he felt threatened, he'd strike back hard. Clara rolled onto her side, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Tomorrow she'd meet with Sarah Chen. Tomorrow she'd lay out the evidence and hope the lawyer could see a path forward. Tomorrow she'd take another step toward reclaiming what had been stolen from her. But tonight, alone in the darkness of her childhood bedroom, Clara allowed herself to be afraid. The next day dawned hot and cloudless, the kind of Texas morning that promised a brutal afternoon. Clara went through her usual routine, up at 4:30, coffee, cooking breakfast for the hands, but her movements were mechanical, her mind already in Sarah Chen's office, already planning what she'd say. Ethan appeared for breakfast as always, but they didn't speak beyond the usual pleasantries. Too many ears around, too many potential witnesses to a conversation that needed to stay private. The meeting with Sarah Chen was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Clara left right after lunch, telling the Cowboys she had errands in town. The drive to the county seat took 40 minutes, the landscape scrolling past in familiar patterns. Flat scrubland, occasional clumps of mesquite, ranch houses set far back from the road. Sarah Chen's office was on the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street. sandwiched between a hardware store and a real estate agency. Clara climbed the narrow stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, smiled and told her to go right in. Sarah Chen was waiting. The lawyer stood as Clara entered, extending her hand. She was exactly as Clara remembered. Late 50s, steel gray hair cut in a no-nonsense bob, sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. She wore a simple black suit that spoke of competence rather than flash. "Clara Whitaker," Sarah said, her grip firm. "I was sorry to hear about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Please, sit. Your call yesterday intrigued me. You mentioned needing help with your father's estate." Clara sat in the leather chair across from Sarah's desk and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. Either Sarah Chen would help them, or Clara would have just exposed herself to another potential enemy. "I lied," Clara said bluntly. "This isn't about the estate, not exactly. It's about fraud, theft, and corruption, and I need to know if you're willing to help me fight it." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Interest, maybe, or recognition. "I'm listening," she said. So Clara told her everything, about the missing supplies, the unpaid wages, the cattle sales that didn't match the deposits, about Hartman's visit and the papers she'd refused to sign, about Ethan's revelation that he owned the ranch, about the evidence they'd been gathering. She laid it all out, holding nothing back, and watched Sarah's face for any sign of judgment or disbelief or, worse, complicity. When Clara finally finished, the office was silent except for the tick of an old clock on the wall. Sarah had been taking notes throughout the story, her pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. Now she set it down and leaned back in her chair. "This is serious," she said. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, we're talking about systematic fraud on a massive scale." "It's all true. I have evidence." "Evidence that was obtained how?" Clara hesitated. "By going through files in the ranch office." "Files you had permission to access?" No, not exactly." Sarah nodded slowly. "That complicates things. Anything obtained through an illegal search could be thrown out in court. But," she held up a hand as Clara started to protest, "it can also point us toward legal ways of obtaining the same information. What matters is whether we can subpoena the official records and whether those records will show the same discrepancies. So you'll help us." "I didn't say that yet. I have questions first. Starting with this Ethan Cross. You said he owns the ranch now through a holding company?" "Yes, High Point Holdings." Sarah wrote that down. "And you trust him?" It was the question Clara had been asking herself for days. Did she trust Ethan? A man who'd lied by omission for weeks, who'd bought her father's ranch without telling her, who seemed to know far too much about deception and violence. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I don't have a lot of options. Either he's on my side or I'm fighting this alone." "There's another possibility," Sarah said carefully. "He could be using you to eliminate Rhett Calder so he can take full control of the ranch without interference." The thought had occurred to Clara, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it feel more real, more threatening. If that's his plan, why go through all this trouble? Why not just fire Rhett and be done with it? Because Rhett probably has enough dirt on the operation to cause serious legal problems if he's fired without cause. Better to build a criminal case, let the law handle him, and emerge as the hero who saved the ranch from corruption. Clara felt sick. "You think that's what this is?" "I think it's a possibility you need to consider. Men who buy distressed properties through shell companies usually aren't in it for altruistic reasons." "He said he owed my father a debt." And that may even be true, but debt and business are different things. You need to protect yourself, Clara, not just from Rhett, but from everyone. It was good advice. Clara knew it was good advice, but it also meant trusting no one, suspecting everyone, fighting completely alone. She was so tired of being alone. "Will you help me or not?" Clara asked, hearing the exhaustion in her own voice. Sarah studied her for a long moment. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a legal pad. "Yes," she said, "I'll help you. Your father was one of the few truly decent men I've known in my 30 years of practicing law. If his ranch is being stolen out from under his daughter, I want to stop it. But we do this carefully and legally. No more searching files without permission. No more gathering evidence through illegal means. Understand? I understand. Good. Now I'm going to need copies of everything you and Mr. Cross have found. Bank statements, contracts, invoices, all of it. Then I'm going to request official records through proper legal channels and see if they match. If they don't, we'll have grounds for a full investigation. How long will that take? Weeks, probably. Maybe months. We don't have months. Rhett's back in 2 days if he finds out we're investigating him. Then you need to be very careful for the next 2 days. Keep your head down. Don't give him any reason to suspect you know what he's been doing. Can you do that? Clara thought about Hartman's visit, about how she'd refused to sign the papers. Rhett probably already knew she was becoming a problem. But Sarah was right. Running at this head-on would only get Clara hurt, or worse. I can try, she said. That'll have to be good enough. They spent the next hour going over details, Sarah asking precise questions about dates, amounts, people involved. Clara answered as best she could, grateful for the lawyer's methodical approach. This was someone who understood how to build a case, how to navigate the system. This was someone who might actually be able to help. As the meeting wound down, Sarah walked Clara to the door. One more thing, the lawyer said. Be very careful about Ethan Cross. I'll do some digging, see what I can find out about him in this High Point Holdings company. But until we know his real agenda, don't tell him everything. Keep some cards close to your chest. He's been the one helping me gather evidence. And that's fine. Let him keep helping. Just don't give him anything he could use against you later. Trust, but verify. That's the lawyer's motto. Clara nodded, though the advice sat heavy in her chest. Ethan was the only ally she had on the ranch, the only person who seemed to understand what they were up against. The thought of suspecting him, of holding back, made her feel even more isolated than before. But maybe that was the price of survival in a world built on lies and betrayal. She drove back to the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty of it felt wrong somehow, too lovely for a day that had left her feeling hollowed out and uncertain. Ethan was waiting for her when she pulled up to the house. He stood on the porch, his posture casual, but his eyes alert. "How'd it go?" he asked as Clara climbed the steps. "She'll help, but it's going to take time. She needs to request official records, build a legal case." "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe months." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We might not have that long." "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on both of them. Then Ethan said quietly, "There might be another way." "What do you mean?" "Someone I know. Someone who can access banking records without going through official channels." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean illegally?" "I mean quickly, efficiently, in a way that gets us the information we need without waiting for courts and subpoenas." Sarah said we have to do this legally, that anything obtained illegally won't hold up in court. That's true. But sometimes you need leverage before you go to court. You need to know what you're walking into, what they're hiding, how deep the corruption goes. This person can give us that. Clara studied his face, trying to read the truth behind his words. Was this genuine help, or was it the first step in whatever manipulation Sarah had warned her about? Trust, but verify. "Who is this person?" she asked. "Someone I've worked with before. Someone who owes me a favor." "That's not an answer. It's all the answer you're going to get. Either you trust me or you don't, Clara. Which is it?" The question hung between them like a blade. Clara knew her answer would set the course for everything that came next. Trust him and risk being used. Refuse and face Red alone. Neither option felt safe. But then, nothing had felt safe for a very long time. "Do it," she said finally. "Get the information. But Ethan, if you're playing me, if this is all just some scheme to take everything my father built, I will find a way to destroy you. I don't care what it costs me." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll make the call tonight." He left, disappearing into the gathering dusk, and Clara went inside to start dinner. Her hands moved through the familiar tasks, chopping, stirring, seasoning, while her mind churned with doubts and fears and the terrible weight of choices made. Somewhere in Houston, Rhett Calder was conducting whatever business had taken him away. In 2 days, he'd returned to find a woman who was no longer willing to sign blindly, no longer willing to stay silent. The war Clara had declared in Ethan's presence was about to become very, very real. And she had no idea if she was strong enough to survive it. Rhett Calder returned from Houston 2 days early. Clara was in the kitchen kneading dough for the evening's biscuits when she heard his truck roar up the driveway, the engine's aggressive growl announcing his arrival like a war drum. Her hand stilled in the flour, her heart lurching into an unsteady rhythm. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. What had changed? Through the window she watched Rhett climb out of his truck, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Even from this distance she could read the anger in his movements, the rigid set of his shoulders, the sharp gestures as he barked orders at 2 cowboys who'd been working near the barn. Something had gone wrong in Houston. Something that had brought him racing back here like a man with hell on his heels. Clara forced herself to breathe normally, to return her attention to the dough. Just the cook, just going about her daily routine. Nothing to see here. But her hands trembled as she worked, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway less than 5 minutes later, his presence so sudden and silent that Clara nearly jumped out of her skin. "He's back," Ethan said quietly, unnecessarily. "I noticed." "And he's furious. Heard him on the phone when I passed the barn. Someone tipped him off about Hartman's visit." Clara's stomach dropped. "How much does he know?" "Enough to be dangerous. He knows you refused to sign the papers. He knows you're asking questions." "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan. Act normal. Don't give him any reason to think we're working together." "And if he confronts me?" Ethan's expression went hard. "Then you don't face him alone. Understand? If he comes at you, you find me immediately." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say she could handle Rhett herself, but the truth was she'd never been able to handle him. He'd spent 2 years steamrolling over her objections, dismissing her concerns, making her feel small and insignificant. The thought of standing up to him now, when he was already angry and suspicious, made her mouth go dry with fear. "Okay," she whispered. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, as if trying to transfer some of his own steel through sheer force of will. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the ranch's rhythms before anyone could notice how long he'd been in the kitchen. Clara returned to her biscuits with shaking hands. The confrontation came sooner than she'd expected. Rhett strode into the kitchen an hour later, his boots loud on the wooden floor, his presence filling the space like smoke. Clara was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, and she forced herself not to turn around, not to show fear. "We need to talk," Rhett said, his voice a low growl. "I'm busy with dinner." "I don't give a damn about dinner. Turn around and look at me when I'm talking to you." Clara set down her spoon carefully, using the small action to gather her composure. Then she turned to face him. Rhett looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his face haggard beneath the perpetual sunburn. But there was nothing tired about the anger radiating from him. It was sharp and focused and directed entirely at her. "Gerald Hartman tells me you refused to sign some important documents," Rhett said, each word clipped and precise. "That's right. Care to explain why?" "I don't sign papers I haven't read." "Not anymore." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Those papers were critical for restructuring the ranch's debt. By refusing to sign, you may have cost us favorable interest rates that would have saved thousands of dollars." "Then Mr. Hartman should have given me time to have them reviewed by a lawyer." "A lawyer?" Rhett's laugh was ugly. "Since when do you have a lawyer?" "Since I decided I needed one." The silence that followed felt explosive. Rhett took a step closer, and Clara had to fight every instinct that screamed at her to back away. She held her ground, spine straight, hands clenched at her sides. "You're making a mistake," Rhett said quietly. "A big one." "Am I? Or am I finally waking up to mistakes I've already made?" "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means I've been signing papers blindly for 3 years. It means I've been taking your word on things I should have verified myself. It means I'm done being treated like I'm too stupid to understand basic business. Rhett's face flushed dark red. Watch your mouth. Or what? You'll fire me? I'd like to see you try running this ranch without someone to feed your men. It was a dangerous card to play, and Clara knew it. But something in her had snapped, some final thread of patience or fear or submission. She was 40 years old, and she'd spent half her life being dismissed and diminished and pushed aside. If Rhett wanted a fight, she'd give him one. You think you're irreplaceable? Rhett asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You think this ranch needs you? I think this ranch needed my father, and I'm all that's left of him. I think the men respect that, even if you don't. The men respect whoever signs their paychecks, and that ain't you. Really? When was the last time they got a full paycheck, Rhett? When was the last time you paid them what they're actually owed? The words were out before Clara could stop them. She saw Rhett's expression shift from anger to something colder, more calculating. She'd just revealed that she knew about the wage theft. She'd shown her hand too early. Who's been talking to you? Rhett asked softly. No one. I have eyes. I pay attention. Bullshit. Someone's been filling your head with lies. Numbers don't lie. And I've been keeping track of numbers my whole life. Rhett studied her with eyes that had gone flat and reptilian. Clara felt her skin crawl, felt the predator sizing up its prey. She'd pushed too hard, revealed too much, and now Rhett knew she was a threat. You're going to regret this, he said finally. Whatever game you think you're playing, it's going to end badly for you. Is that a threat? It's a promise. He turned and stalked out, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen, with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She gripped the edge of the stove to keep from collapsing, her legs suddenly weak as water. What had she done? What had she just unleashed? The answer came faster than she could have imagined. That evening, after the hands had eaten their dinner and dispersed into the cooling night, Clara was cleaning up when she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn. Male voices, angry and overlapping. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting wood, followed by a sharp cry of pain. Clara's first instinct was to stay in the kitchen, to keep her head down and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But her second instinct, the one that sounded like her father's voice in her head, told her to investigate. Someone might be hurt. Someone might need help. She grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the barn, her heart pounding. As she got closer, the voices became clearer. I don't care what you heard. That was Rhett, his voice thick with rage. You work for me and you'll keep your mouth shut about ranch business. We got a right to know why our wages are short. Another voice, younger. Tommy Reeves, Claire realized. Sweet-natured Tommy, who always complimented her cooking. You got a right to nothing except what I tell you. Now get out of my sight before I... Clara rounded the corner of the barn and froze. Rhett had Tommy backed against the wall, one meaty fist twisted in the young man's shirt. Two other cowboys stood nearby, Davis and an older hand named Martinez, their faces tense with anger and uncertainty. No one had noticed Clara yet. You're stealing from us, Tommy said, and despite his fear, there was conviction in his voice. We all know it. The question is what we're going to do about it. Rhett's response was to slam Tommy against the wall hard enough to rattle the boards. What you're going to do is shut your mouth and get back to work. Unless you want to end up like... Like who, Rhett? Clara's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned to stare at her. In the harsh light of the barn's exterior lamps, she could see the shock on their faces. Shock that she was there. Shock that she'd spoken. Shock that the quiet cook had inserted herself into a confrontation between the foreman and his men. Rhett's eyes narrowed. This doesn't concern you, Clara. Go back to the house. It concerns me when my ranch hands are being threatened on my property. Your property? Rhett laughed, releasing Tommy and turning his full attention to Clara. You still think this is your property? You're even more deluded than I thought. And you're even more corrupt than I imagined. But I'm learning fast. The other cowboys were watching the exchange with wide eyes, heads swiveling between Clara and Rhett like spectators at a tennis match. Clara could feel their attention, could sense the shift happening in real time. She was supposed to be invisible, irrelevant, but here she stood, directly challenging the man who controlled everything. You need to be very careful, Rhett said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. Very, very careful. Or what? You'll do to me what you were about to do to Tommy? I wasn't going to do anything to him except remind him of his place. His place is as an employee who deserves to be paid fairly for his work, something you've been failing to do for months. Rhett took a step toward her, and Clara's courage wavered. He was a big man, easily 6'3" and well over 200 pounds. She was 5'6" and strong from years of physical labor, but no match for him in a physical confrontation. But she didn't back down. Couldn't back down. Not with the Cowboys watching, not with everything riding on this moment. You don't know what you're talking about, Rhett said. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know about the missing wages. I know about the cattle sales that don't match the deposits. I know about the supplies that disappear between the invoice and the delivery. Should I go on? The color drained from Rhett's face, then flooded back twice as dark. Who told you? No one had to tell me. I can read, Rhett. I can add and subtract, and I've been paying attention. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually hit her, his fists clenched, his whole body coiling like a snake preparing to strike. But then, from somewhere behind her came a new voice. There a problem here? Clara turned to find Ethan standing at the edge of the lamplight, his posture deceptively relaxed. But there was nothing relaxed about his eyes. They were locked on Rhett with the focus of a predator watching prey. No problem, Rhett said tightly. Just having a conversation. Looked like more than a conversation from where I'm standing. No one asked you, Cross. Maybe not, but I'm making it my business anyway. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Tommy and the other Cowboys had gone very still, sensing that something significant was happening but not quite understanding what. Clara felt caught between two forces, Rhett's rage and Ethan's cold menace, and she wasn't sure which one frightened her more. You've been here less than a month, Rhett said to Ethan. You don't get to have opinions about how I run things. I have opinions about men threatening women that I do have a say in. No one threatened anyone. That's not how it looked to me. Rhett's jaw worked, and Clara could see him struggling to maintain control. He was outnumbered now, not physically, but morally. With witnesses watching, with Clara and Ethan presenting a united front, he couldn't simply use force to solve his problem. But that didn't mean he was backing down. This isn't over, Rhett said, looking directly at Clara. Not by a long shot. He turned and strode away into the darkness, his footsteps echoing off the barn walls. The moment he disappeared, Tommy let out a shaky breath. Miss Clara, you shouldn't have done that, he said. He's dangerous when he's angry. I know, but I'm tired of being scared. Davis spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. Is it true? What you said about him stealing from us? Clara looked at the three Cowboys, young Tommy with his baby face, grizzled Martinez with his sun-weathered skin, Davis with his desperate eyes. These were men who'd given their sweat and blood to this ranch, who deserved the truth. Yes, she said simply. It's true, and I'm going to prove it. How? Martinez asked. By doing what I should have done years ago, fighting back. The men exchanged glances, and Clara could see the war happening behind their eyes. Hope fighting with fear, anger wrestling with resignation. They'd been beaten down for so long, told to be patient and accept what they were given. The idea that someone might actually stand up for them was almost too much to believe. We'll help, Tommy said suddenly. Whatever you need. Tommy, Martinez started. No, I'm done. We all are. Right? Tommy looked at the other two men. After a moment, Davis nodded. Then Martinez, slower, but just as certain. We're with you, Miss Clara, Davis said. Your daddy was good to us. We owe him. We owe you. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. For so long, she'd felt alone in this fight. But here stood proof that she wasn't. Here were men willing to risk their livelihoods, maybe even their safety, because it was right. Thank you, she managed. But you need to be careful. Rhett's going to be watching all of us now. Let him watch, Tommy said with more courage than Clara had heard from him before. We got nothing to hide. Ethan, who'd been silent through this exchange, finally spoke. Everyone needs to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day. The Cowboys nodded and headed off toward the bunkhouse, their voices low and urgent as they discussed what had just happened. Clara stood with Ethan in the pool of lamplight, suddenly exhausted. You shouldn't have confronted him. Ethan said quietly. Not like that. Not without backup. I had backup. You showed up. I almost didn't make it in time. If I'd been 30 seconds later, but you weren't. Ethan shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. This isn't a game, Clara. Rhett's not going to just accept defeat and walk away. He's going to come at us with everything he has. I know. Do you? Because you just declared war in front of witnesses. There's no taking it back now. Clara knew he was right. She'd let her anger override her caution, had pushed Rhett into a corner where his only options were to fight or flee. And men like Rhett Calder didn't flee. What's done is done, she said. We deal with what comes next. And when he retaliates, when he tries to hurt you or the men who just pledged to help you, then we make sure we have enough evidence to bury him before he gets the chance. Ethan studied her in the lamplight, and Clara wondered what he saw. A foolish woman who'd just made a fatal mistake? Or someone finally finding the courage to stand up for what was right? My contact came through, Ethan said after a long moment. The banking records. They're worse than we thought. How much worse? Over $2 million, Clara. That's how much has been stolen from this ranch over the past 4 years. The number was so staggering that Clara couldn't quite process it. $2 million. Enough to have saved the ranch a dozen times over. Enough to have paid the Cowboys their full wages with plenty left over. Enough to have prevented everything. The debt, the foreclosure, the loss of her inheritance. All of it stolen, all of it gone. Who else is involved? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 people at the bank, a loan officer, an account manager, and someone higher up. We're still working on identifying them, plus Rhett and at least 2 cattle buyers who've been helping him falsify sale records. How do we prove it? The records my contact obtained aren't admissible in court, but they show us exactly where to look. Sarah Chen can request the official documents through legal channels, and they should match what we already have. Once that happens, we've got them. How long? Sarah said weeks. Maybe months. We don't have months. You saw what just happened. Rhett's going to make his move soon. Ethan's expression went grim. I know. That's why we need to accelerate everything. Tomorrow I'm driving to the county seat to meet with the prosecutor directly. I'll show them what we have, explain the urgency. Maybe we can get emergency subpoenas. Freeze the accounts involved. Something. And if they won't help? Then we go to the state attorney general, the FBI if we have to. But one way or another, this ends. Soon. Clara nodded, trying to draw strength from his certainty. But all she felt was fear, a cold, gnawing dread that whispered she'd just set events in motion that would destroy everything she had left. They walked back to the house together, not speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. At the porch steps, Ethan paused. Lock your doors tonight, he said. Windows too. And keep your phone close. You think he'd try something tonight? I think he's desperate and cornered, and we just humiliated him in front of his men. So yes, I think he might try something. Clara felt ice slide down her spine. Where will you be? Close. I'm sleeping in the barn tonight. If anything happens, you scream, and I'll be there in 30 seconds. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it just emphasized how much danger they were all in. Clara went inside, locked the doors as instructed, and stood in her dark kitchen listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere out there, Rhett was planning his next move. Somewhere, the men at the bank who'd helped him steal $2 million were probably being warned that their scheme was unraveling. Somewhere, forces Clara couldn't see were gathering to protect what they'd built through corruption and theft. And she'd just painted a target on her own back. Sleep didn't come. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound. Around 2 a.m, she heard a truck start up somewhere on the property. She went to her window and saw taillights disappearing down the driveway. Someone leaving in the middle of the night. Rhett? One of the hands? She thought about calling Ethan, but what would she say? Someone drove away. It could be nothing, except nothing felt like nothing anymore. Morning came gray and oppressive, the sky thick with clouds that promised rain but wouldn't deliver. Clara went through the motions of breakfast preparation with exhausted hands, nearly cutting herself twice because her attention kept drifting. The Cowboys came in for their meal subdued and watchful. Tommy gave her a small nod of solidarity. Martinez squeezed her shoulder as he passed. Even the men who hadn't witnessed last night's confrontation seemed to sense that something had shifted, that the ranch they'd known was transforming into something else. Rhett didn't appear for breakfast. His absence was somehow more unsettling than his presence would have been. Ethan ate quickly and left, heading to his meeting with the county prosecutor. Clara watched him go with a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. They were running out of time. She could feel it like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable. Around 10 o'clock, Sheriff Jack Morrison arrived. Clara saw his cruiser pull up and felt her stomach drop. Morrison was a good old boy through and through, mid-50s, overweight, more interested in keeping the peace than enforcing the law. He and Rhett were drinking buddies. His presence here, now, couldn't mean anything good. She met him at the door before he could knock. "Sheriff Morrison, what can I do for you?" Morrison took off his hat, his expression uncomfortable. "Morning, Clara. Sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you some questions." "About what?" "About a theft that was reported last night, from the ranch office." Clara's blood went cold. "What theft?" "Rhett says someone broke into his office and stole important documents, financial records, contracts, that sort of thing. He seems to think you might know something about it." Of course. Of course Rhett would do this. Turn the tables, make her the criminal, use the law to protect himself. "I don't know anything about any theft," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Mind if I come in and look around?" "Do you have a warrant?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "A warrant? Clara, I'm just asking some friendly questions. No need to make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult. I'm asking if you have a legal right to search my home." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Now, why would you be worried about me searching if you've got nothing to hide? Why would you need to search if Rhett's the one claiming something was stolen from his office?" They stared at each other, and Clara saw the moment Morrison decided she was being uncooperative, difficult, a problem that needed to be solved. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Morrison said, his voice taking on an official tone. "Do you know anything about documents being taken from the ranch office?" "No." "Have you been in the ranch office recently?" Clara's mind raced. She'd been in there searching for evidence, but that was days ago. Was that what Rhett was claiming had been stolen? Or had he manufactured this entire theft just to give Morrison an excuse to search her home? "I'm in and out of that office regularly," Clara said carefully. "I have to discuss supply orders and household budgets with Rhett." "But you haven't taken any documents." "No." "You're sure about that?" "I'm sure." Morrison studied her with narrowed eyes, and Clara could see him trying to decide if she was lying. Finally, he seemed to reach a conclusion. "All right then, but if you do happen to remember anything, you give me a call. Understand?" "Of course, Sheriff." He put his hat back on and headed toward his cruiser, but paused before climbing in. "Clara, a word of advice. Whatever's going on between you and Rhett, whatever fight you think you're having, let it go. Rhett Calder's got friends in this county. Powerful friends. You keep pushing, and you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of a lot of trouble." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's a warning. From someone who's known you since you were a kid. Your daddy was a good man, but he's gone now. You're on your own out here. Think about that." He drove away, leaving Clara standing on the porch with her hands clenched into fists. The message couldn't have been clearer. The sheriff was on Rhett's side. The law was on Rhett's side. If this came down to her word against Rhett's, she'd lose, unless they had evidence so overwhelming that even Morrison couldn't ignore it. Clara was still standing there, trying to process what had just happened, when she heard the sound of breaking glass from inside the house. She spun around and ran inside, her heart in her throat. The sound had come from her bedroom. She burst through the door and found the window shattered, a brick lying on her floor surrounded by glittering shards of glass. There was a note tied to the brick with twine. Clara's hands shook as she untied it and unfolded the paper. The message was written in blocky letters, probably disguised handwriting. "Stop asking questions, or next time it won't be a window." She stood there holding the note, staring at the words, feeling the full weight of what she'd gotten herself into. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't just about corruption or fraud or her father's legacy. This was about survival. And someone had just made it very clear that her life was in danger. Clara's first call was to Ethan. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense. "What's wrong?" Someone threw a brick through my bedroom window. There was a note, a threat. Silence. Then, I'm turning around. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Lock yourself in the kitchen and don't open the door for anyone. Ethan, do it, Clara. Now. He hung up. Clara stood in her destroyed bedroom, looking at the brick, the glass, the note that promised violence. Then she did exactly what Ethan had told her to do. She locked herself in the kitchen and waited. Ethan made it back in 15 minutes, his truck skidding to a stop in the driveway. He came through the door like a storm, his eyes sweeping the kitchen for threats before landing on Clara. "Show me," he said. They went to her bedroom together. Ethan examined the window, the brick, the note. His expression grew darker with each detail. "This is escalation," he said quietly. "They're trying to scare you into backing down. It's working." "Good." Clara stared at him. "Good?" "Fear is smart right now. Fear keeps you careful, keeps you alive." He turned to face her fully. "Clara, we need to get you off this ranch, tonight. Rhett's making his move and we can't protect you here. I'm not leaving. Don't be stubborn. This isn't about pride. This is about everything. This is my father's ranch, my home, my entire life. I'm not abandoning it because some coward threw a brick through my window. That coward is telling you what he'll do next. Clara, please, be reasonable." "No, I've been reasonable for 3 years and it cost me everything. I'm done running, done hiding, done letting other people make my decisions for me." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Clara's expression must have convinced him it was pointless. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. Then we fortify. I'm moving into the house. I'll sleep on the couch in the front room. Anyone wants to get to you, they go through me first." "Ethan, you can't." "Yes, I can, and I will. This isn't negotiable." They stared at each other, wills clashing. Finally, Clara nodded. She was scared enough to accept help, even if it meant having Ethan that close, that involved in her life. "What about the prosecutor?" she asked. "What did they say?" Ethan's expression grew grim. "They said they need more time to review the evidence, that they can't just rush into an investigation without proper documentation, that we should be patient." "Patient? While someone's threatening to kill me?" "I told them about the threats. They said to report it to the local sheriff." Clara laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "The local sheriff who just warned me to back off? That sheriff?" "Yeah, that's when I decided to turn around and come back here." "So we're on our own." "We're on our own." Clara sank onto her bed, careful to avoid the broken glass. All the fight drained out of her, leaving only exhaustion and fear. They'd been so close. Had evidence, had a plan, had hope. And now it was all falling apart. "What do we do?" she asked. Ethan crouched down in front of her, his pale eyes intent on her face. "We document everything. The brick, the note, the sheriff's visit, all of it. We create a record that can't be ignored. And then we go over everyone's heads, State Attorney General, FBI, someone who isn't in Rhett's pocket. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you stay alive. You stay safe. And you trust that I won't let anything happen to you." It was a promise he had no right to make, a guarantee he couldn't possibly keep. But Clara found herself wanting to believe him anyway, wanting to trust that someone, anyone, was on her side in this nightmare she'd stumbled into. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. Ethan boarded up Clara's broken window, moved his things into the house, and set up a rotation with Tommy and Martinez where someone would always be watching the approaches to the main house. The other Cowboys, learning about the threat, rallied around Clara with a protectiveness that brought tears to her eyes. These men, who had every reason to abandon a sinking ship, were choosing to stand with her instead. Night fell like a hammer. Clara lay in her bed, now in a different room with intact windows, and listened to Ethan moving around in the front of the house. The knowledge that he was there should have been comforting. Instead, it just reminded her how much danger they were all in. Somewhere around midnight, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. She woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, Clara thought she was dreaming. Then she heard shouting, saw the orange glow through her window, and reality crashed over her like a wave. Fire. The ranch was on fire. She bolted from bed, threw on clothes with shaking hands, and ran into the main room. Ethan was already gone, the front door standing open. Through it, Clara could see flames reaching into the night sky. The barn. The main barn was burning. She ran outside into chaos. Cowboys were running in every direction, some trying to get horses out of the stables, others forming a bucket brigade from the well. But the fire was too big, too hot, spreading too fast. Within minutes, it became clear they weren't going to save the barn. The question was whether they could keep it from spreading to the other buildings. Clara joined the bucket brigade, passing water hand to hand, her arms burning, her lungs seared by smoke and heat. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the desperate rhythm of grab, pass, grab, pass, grab, pass. At some point, she became aware of Ethan beside her, his face black with soot, his eyes wild. "Everyone's out!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. "All the horses, all the hands, everyone's safe." It was small comfort as they watched 100 years of history burn to the ground. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later, but by then there was nothing to do except keep the fire from spreading. They managed to save the other buildings, managed to keep the flames from jumping to the dry grass that would have turned the entire ranch into an inferno. But the barn was gone, completely, utterly destroyed. As dawn broke over the devastation, Clara stood looking at the smoldering ruins with tears streaming down her face. It had been her father's barn. He'd built it himself with help from neighbors, had raised the frame with his own hands. It had housed generations of horses, stored decades of hay and equipment. Now it was ash and twisted metal. Sheriff Morrison showed up around 7 a.m., looking grim. He surveyed the damage, talked to the fire chief, and then approached Clara where she stood wrapped in a blanket someone had given her. "Fire chief says it was arson," Morrison said without preamble. "Someone doused the north corner in accelerant and lit it up." Clara felt numb. "Who?" "That's what I'm supposed to be investigating. But Clara, I'm going to ask you straight out. Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you?" The question was so absurd given everything that had happened that Clara actually laughed. It came out harsh and broken. "You want me to answer that? After you came here yesterday warning me to back off? After someone threw a brick through my window with a death threat attached? You're seriously asking if I have enemies?" Morrison's face reddened. "Now hold on. No, you hold on. This ranch is being destroyed piece by piece, and you know exactly who's behind it. But you won't do anything because Rhett Calder's your friend, and his friends at the bank have money and influence, and I'm just the daughter of a dead rancher who doesn't matter. That's not... Where were you last night, Sheriff? Where was the law when someone burned down my barn? Where's the protection I'm supposed to get?" Morrison looked away, unable to meet her eyes. And in that moment, Clara understood the full depth of her isolation. The law wasn't going to help her. The authorities weren't going to save her. She was alone in enemy territory, watching everything burn. Ethan appeared at her elbow, his presence solid and grounding. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you might want to know that we have evidence of systematic fraud involving this ranch. Evidence that points to multiple people, including someone in your department." Morrison's head snapped up. "What?" "Financial records showing $2 million stolen over 4 years, bank documents falsified, wages stolen from workers. We've already contacted the state attorney general's office. They'll be sending investigators down here within the week." It was a bluff. They hadn't reached the attorney general yet, but Morrison didn't know that. Clara watched the color drain from the sheriff's face. "You're making serious accusations," Morrison said. "We're stating facts. And if I were you, Sheriff, I'd start thinking real hard about which side of this investigation you want to be on when it all comes out." Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away without another word. Clara watched him go, then looked at Ethan. "Was any of that true?" "Most of it. We'll make the rest true today." "They burned my barn." "I know." "They're trying to destroy everything." "I know." "What happens next?" Ethan looked at the smoking ruins, his expression hard as iron. "Next, we stop playing defense. Next, we bring the whole damn thing crashing down on their heads." Clara nodded, wiping tears from her smoke-stained face. She'd tried to be patient, tried to build a legal case, tried to do things the right way. But the right way had gotten her barn burned and her life threatened and her father's legacy reduced to ash. It was time to fight fire with fire. The ashes were still warm when Rhett made his mistake. He showed up at the ranch around noon, his truck pulling into the driveway with an almost casual slowness. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he climbed out, surveyed the smoking ruins of the barn with what looked like genuine shock, and then headed toward the house. She met him at the door before he could knock. "Clara," he said, and there was something in his voice, concern maybe, or a convincing imitation of it. "I just heard about the fire. Are you all right?" "Am I all right?" Clara repeated, her voice flat. "My barn burned down last night, the barn my father built with his own hands. So, no, Rhett, I'm not all right." "Do they know what caused it?" "Arson. Someone doused it in accelerant and lit a match." Rhett's expression shifted, became harder. "You think I had something to do with this?" "Did you? How dare you? How dare I?" Clara's voice rose, all the exhaustion and fear and rage of the past weeks pouring out at once. "You've been stealing from this ranch for years. You've been threatening me, manipulating me, using me, and now my barn is ash and you have the audacity to stand here and act offended?" Rhett took a step closer, his face flushing dark red. "You need to watch your mouth. Or what? You'll burn down something else, throw another brick through my window, kill me?" "I didn't—" Rhett caught himself, his jaw snapping shut, but Clara had seen it. The flash of guilt, the momentary panic in his eyes. He hadn't meant to say anything, hadn't meant to reveal that he knew about the brick. But he'd slipped, and they both knew it. "You didn't what?" Clara pressed. "Didn't know about the brick? Because I never told you about it. The only people who know are me, Ethan, and whoever threw it." Rhett's hands clenched into fists. "Someone must have mentioned it." "Who? I haven't talked to anyone except Ethan and the sheriff. And Morrison sure as hell wouldn't have told you since he's supposed to be investigating it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Clara could see Rhett's mind working, trying to find a way out of the trap he'd walked into. But there wasn't one. He'd revealed his hand, and they both knew it. "You're going to regret this," Rhett said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you can prove, it won't matter. You're going to lose everything, Clara. The ranch, your reputation, maybe even your life. And it'll be your own fault for not knowing when to quit." He turned and walked away, climbing back into his truck and driving off with enough speed to send gravel spraying. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, replaying the conversation in her head. He'd slipped. He'd actually slipped. Ethan appeared from wherever he'd been watching, his expression grim. "You get that?" Clara asked. He held up his phone. Every word, video and audio. Clara felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. They'd planned this, knew Rhett would come to gloat or assess the damage, knew his arrogance might make him careless. And it had worked. They had him admitting knowledge of the brick attack, had him on video making threats. It wasn't proof that he'd burned the barn, but it was a start. "Now what?" Clara asked. "Now we make him desperate enough to make more mistakes. And we do it fast before he realizes what he gave away." They spent the afternoon putting their plan into motion. Ethan made calls to the state attorney general's office, to a reporter at the Houston Chronicle who specialized in agricultural fraud, to a federal investigator he knew from his mysterious past. Clara didn't ask how he had these connections. She was just grateful he did. Sarah Chen arrived around 3 p.m., her face drawn with concern. She'd heard about the fire on the news and driven straight out from the county seat. "This has gone too far," she said, standing in Clara's kitchen and looking at the legal documents spread across the table. "We need to get law enforcement involved immediately." "We've tried," Clara said tiredly. "The local sheriff is in Rhett's pocket. The county prosecutor wants more time to review evidence. Everyone keeps telling us to be patient while my ranch burns down around me." Sarah's expression hardened. "Then we go nuclear. I'm filing emergency motions with the state court, requesting immediate asset freezes on all accounts connected to the ranch, requesting emergency injunctions to prevent any further property transfers, and requesting protection orders for you and everyone involved in this investigation." "Will it work?" Ethan asked. "It'll get attention. Whether it works depends on how fast the court moves and whether Rhett's connections extend to the state judiciary." Sarah began gathering the documents, organizing them with practiced efficiency. "But it's our best shot. We can't keep playing defense while they destroy everything. There's something else, Ethan said. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah the video of Rhett's slip about the brick. The lawyer watched it twice, her expression growing sharper with each viewing. This is good, she said finally. This shows consciousness of guilt. Combined with the other evidence, it establishes a pattern of intimidation and violence. I can use this. How long before we get a response? Clara asked. If I file today and mark everything as emergency motions? 24 to 48 hours. Maybe less if we get lucky with the judge assignment. And if Rhett finds out we've filed? Sarah looked at her seriously. Then he'll know his time is running out, and he'll act accordingly. You need to be very, very careful until the court rules. Clara thought about the burned barn, the brick through her window, Rhett's flat eyes promising violence. Being careful felt like closing the barn door after the horses had already escaped. But she nodded anyway. We'll be careful. Sarah left with boxes full of documents, promising to work through the night if necessary. Claire and Ethan were left alone in the kitchen, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows and painting everything gold. You should eat something, Ethan said quietly. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since breakfast. You need to keep your strength up. Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She fixed them both sandwiches with mechanical efficiency, and they ate in silence at the kitchen table. Outside, she could see some of the Cowboys working to clean up debris from the fire, their movements slow with exhaustion. Tommy came to me this morning, Ethan said after a while. Said he and some of the other hands want to testify about the missing wages, the threats, all of it. They're willing to go on record. Clara felt her throat tighten. They could lose their jobs. They're going to lose them anyway when this all comes out. At least this way they go down swinging. They have families, kids. They need the money, even if it's not full wages. I know, but they also have pride, and they're tired of being cheated by men who think they're too powerless to fight back. Ethan paused, then added quietly, Your father inspired a lot of loyalty, Clara. These men remember how he treated them. They're doing this for him as much as for themselves. The words hit harder than Clara expected. She'd spent so long feeling alone, feeling abandoned by everyone who should have helped her. But these Cowboys, these rough, hard men who worked themselves half to death for poverty wages, they remembered, they cared, they were willing to risk everything for a dead man's daughter. I don't deserve their loyalty, Clara whispered. Yes, you do. You've been fighting for them even when you didn't know it. Every time you stretched the food budget to make sure they got decent meals. Every time you stood up to Rhett. Every time you refused to give up on this ranch. They see that. They respect it. Clara wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying. She'd already cried too much, shown too much weakness. But the tears came anyway. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid and surprisingly gentle for someone with so much violence in his past. We're going to win this, he said. I promise you. You can't promise that. Watch me. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, while the sun sank lower and painted the sky in shades of red and purple. It felt like the last quiet moment before a storm, the final breath before diving underwater. Clara knew that whatever came next would change everything. Win or lose, survive or fall, nothing would ever be the same. Night fell with a weight that felt almost physical. Ethan did a complete perimeter check of the property, making sure all the remaining buildings were secure. Tommy and Martinez took first watch, positioned where they could see the approaches to the house. Clara tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made her jump, the settling of old wood, the wind against the windows, the distant call of a coyote. She kept seeing flames in her mind, kept smelling smoke that wasn't there. Around midnight, she gave up and went to the kitchen to make tea. Ethan was already there, sitting at the table in the dark. Can't sleep either? Clara asked. Sleep's overrated. She made them both chamomile tea and sat down across from him. In the darkness, lit only by moonlight through the window, Ethan's face was all shadows and hard angles. Tell me about when you were here before, Clara said. 15 years ago. What were you running from? Ethan was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. I grew up in West Texas. Father was a drunk who liked to use his fists. Mother tried to protect me and my sister, but she was small and he was big. One night when I was 19, he went after my sister, really went after her, not just a slap or a shove. I stepped in. We fought. And when it was over, he wasn't moving. Clara's breath caught. You killed him? I thought I had. Turned out he had a thick skull and a harder head than I gave him credit for. He woke up in the hospital 3 days later, but I didn't know that. I ran. Took what money I could find and just drove. Ended up here because my truck broke down about 5 miles from your father's ranch. And my father helped you. He gave me work. Never asked about my past, never pushed for answers I wasn't ready to give, just treated me like a person who deserved a chance. Ethan's voice roughened with emotion. When I finally told him the truth, you know what he said? He said everyone makes choices they regret, and what matters is what you do after. He said running might have saved my life, but eventually I'd have to stop running and face what I'd done. Is that why you left? I left because I got word that my father had woken up and was telling everyone I'd tried to murder him. There was a warrant out. Your father helped me get a lawyer, helped me understand my options. Eventually, the charges got reduced to assault. I did 2 years in county lockup. When I got out, I was determined to make something of myself. To prove your father's faith in me wasn't misplaced. Clara absorbed this, trying to reconcile the violent young man of Ethan's story with the careful, controlled person sitting across from her. Is that how you made your money? After you got out? I learned computers in lockup, taught myself programming, system security, all of it. When I got out, I started doing security consulting for companies that needed to protect their data, made some good investments, got lucky a few times. 10 years later, I had enough money to do something that mattered, like buying my father's ranch, like saving his daughter from losing everything he built. The words hung between them. Clara wanted to be angry at the presumption, at the idea that she needed saving. But the truth was, she had needed help, still needed it. Without Ethan, she'd have signed away everything months ago without even understanding what she was losing. Thank you, she said quietly, for coming back, for helping. Hush, your father saved my life. This is the least I can do. They finished their tea in comfortable silence, and Clara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Whatever Ethan's past, whatever his reasons, he was here now. He was on her side. And in a world full of enemies, that counted for something. She was about to suggest they both try to get some sleep when Martinez's voice came from outside, sharp and urgent. Someone's coming. Truck heading up the drive. No lights. Clara and Ethan were on their feet instantly. Ethan moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Can you see who it is? Clara asked. No, but they cut their lights before turning onto the property. No one does that unless they're trying to stay hidden. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. What do we do? You stay here. Lock the door behind me. If shooting starts, you get down and stay down. Understand? Ethan? Understand. Yes. He grabbed something from his bag. Clara caught a glimpse of metal, realized with a shock that it was a gun, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned back to her. Whatever happens, you don't come outside, not until I tell you it's safe. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night. Clara locked the door with shaking hands and moved to the window, trying to see what was happening. The truck had stopped about 50 yards from the house. In the moonlight, Clara could make out 3 figures climbing out. They moved with purpose, spreading out in a pattern that suggested military training or at least tactical awareness. This wasn't random. This was planned. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She wanted to call the sheriff, but what good would that do? Morrison wouldn't get here in time, and even if he did, whose side would he be on? She saw Ethan's shadow moving through the darkness, saw Tommy and Martinez converging from their positions. The figures from the truck were getting closer to the house, and Clara realized with horror that they were carrying something. Cans. Large cans that sloshed when they moved. Gasoline. They were going to burn the house down. Clara's paralysis broke. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers fumbling on the touchscreen. 911. What's your emergency? This is Clara Whitaker at the Whitaker Ranch on County Road 12. There are armed men on my property with gasoline. They're going to burn down my house. I need help now. Ma'am, I'm dispatching units to your location. Can you get to safety? I'm locked inside. There are people outside trying to stop them, but the first gunshot cut through the night like a thunderclap. Clara screamed and dropped to the floor, the phone clattering from her hand. She could hear the 911 operator's voice, tinny and distant, asking if she was okay. But Clara couldn't answer, couldn't think, could barely breathe. More gunshots, shouting. The sound of men running, of bodies hitting the ground. Clara crawled to the window and risked a look outside. One of the intruders was down, writhing on the ground. The other two had dropped their gas cans and were returning fire, their muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Clara saw Ethan behind the water trough, saw Tommy sprinting toward better cover, saw Martinez firing from near the burned barn. This was a war zone. Her ranch had become a war zone. Another shot, and one of the intruders spun and fell. The third one seemed to realize he was outmatched. He turned and ran back toward the truck, firing blindly behind him. Ethan rose from cover and fired once, deliberately. The running man stumbled but kept going, reaching the truck and throwing himself inside. The engine roared to life, and the truck peeled out, spraying gravel as it disappeared down the driveway. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ringing in Clara's ears. Then Ethan's voice, sharp and commanding. "Clara, are you hit?" She realized she was still on the floor, realized her hands were pressed against her ears, realized she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "I'm okay," she called back, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "I'm okay. Stay inside until I clear the area." Clara remained on the floor, listening to the sounds of Ethan and the Cowboys checking the fallen intruders, securing the perimeter, making sure there weren't more threats hidden in the darkness. She heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. The sheriff finally coming. Too late, as always. Eventually, Ethan appeared at the door. Clara let him in with trembling hands. "Two of them are down," he said without preamble. "Both alive, but wounded. The third one got away. Martinez is watching them until the sheriff gets here." "Who are they?" "I don't know. They're not ranch hands, not anyone from around here. Professionals, maybe, or close to it." Clara sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. "Rhett sent them." "Probably, but we'll need proof." The sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside, followed by an ambulance and two more patrol cars. Clara watched through the window as Morrison climbed out, his face pale in the flashing lights. This time, he couldn't ignore what had happened. This time, there were bodies and bullets and witnesses. This time, the truth couldn't be buried. Morrison took statements from everyone: Clara, Ethan, Tommy, Martinez, even the two wounded intruders once the paramedics had stabilized them. The story that emerged was damning. The men had been hired through an intermediary told to send a message to the Whitaker Ranch by burning down the main house. They didn't know who'd hired them, had been paid in cash, couldn't identify their employer. But their phones told a different story. Morrison's deputy found text messages, call records, a trail that led directly back to a number registered to Gerald Hartman, the man who'd tried to get Clara to sign those mysterious papers. And Hartman's connection to Rhett was well documented. Clara watched Morrison's face as he processed this information, watched the moment when he realized he couldn't make this go away. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too public to sweep under the rug. "I'm going to need to bring Rhett in for questioning," Morrison said finally, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "Just questioning?" Ethan asked, his voice hard. "I need to build a case. Need to connect the dots legally. But yes, I'm bringing him in." "When?" "Now. Tonight." Morrison looked at Clara, and for the first time she saw something like respect in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara. I should have listened to you sooner. Should have done my job instead of protecting your friend," Clara finished for him. Morrison nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Yeah, that." He left with his deputies, heading to bring in Rhett Calder. Clara stood on her porch and watched the taillights disappear, feeling oddly empty. It should have felt like victory. Rhett was finally going to face consequences. The truth was coming out. Justice was being served. But all Clara felt was tired and scared, and aware that while they'd won a battle, the war wasn't over yet. Ethan came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stood your ground, and you won. We're not done yet. Rhett has powerful friends. They'll fight back. Let them. We've got truth on our side now. That counts for something. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen too much corruption, too much power protecting power, to trust that truth alone would be enough. They went inside as dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The Cowboys who'd stood watch all night finally headed to the bunkhouse for rest. The ranch settled into an uneasy quiet. Clara made coffee by habit, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind spun with exhaustion and adrenaline. She was pouring Ethan a cup when her phone rang. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. "It's early for her to be calling," Clara said, answering. "Sarah? Clara, I need you to listen very carefully." The lawyer's voice was tight with urgency. "The court expedited our emergency motions. The judge is calling a hearing for this afternoon at 2 p.m. Everyone involved needs to be there. You, Ethan, Rhett, representatives from the bank, everyone." "That's good news, right?" "It should be, but I just got a call from a contact at the courthouse. Rhett's lawyers are filing counter motions claiming you and Ethan are the ones who've been defrauding the ranch. They're saying you fabricated evidence, that you've been embezzling money and trying to frame Rhett to cover your tracks." Clara's blood went cold. "That's insane. We have proof." "They have proof too, or at least documents that look like proof. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts in your name, purchase orders with your signature authorizing questionable expenses. It's all fabricated, but it's convincing." "How is that possible? I never authorized anything like that." "They've had years to build a paper trail, Clara. Years to create a narrative where you're the villain and Rhett's the victim. We can fight it, but it's going to be ugly." Ethan had been listening to Clara's side of the conversation, his expression growing darker. "Put her on speaker," he said. Clara did. Sarah's voice filled the kitchen, tight with stress. "The judge who got assigned to this case is Howard Brennan. He's not ideal. He's known for being friendly to business interests, skeptical of fraud claims unless the evidence is absolutely ironclad." "Do we have ironclad evidence?" Ethan asked. "We have good evidence. Whether it's ironclad depends on how well Rhett's lawyers muddy the waters. And these are expensive lawyers, Ethan, the kind that specialize in making black look white and up look down." Clara felt the walls closing in. They'd fought so hard, risked so much, and now Rhett was turning it all around, making her the criminal, making himself the victim. "What do we do?" she asked. "We prepare. We organize every piece of evidence we have into an airtight timeline. We get witness statements from the Cowboys. We document everything that happened last night, the attack, the arrests, the connection to Hartman. And we pray that Judge Brennan sees through the smoke and mirrors. And if he doesn't?" Sarah's pause was answer enough. If the judge sided with Rhett, if he believed the fabricated evidence, Clara could lose everything: the ranch, her freedom, maybe even her life if Rhett decided she was too dangerous to leave walking around. "We'll cross that bridge if we come to it," Sarah said finally. "Right now, focus on getting to the courthouse by 2 p.m. Bring every document we've gathered, every photo, every recording, and Clara, bring your courage. You're going to need it." The call ended. Clara and Ethan looked at each other across the kitchen table, the weight of the coming battle settling over them like a shroud. "He's going to destroy me," Clara said quietly. "Even if we prove he's guilty, he's going to drag me down with him." "No, he's not. You heard Sarah. He has lawyers, money, fabricated evidence, and we have the truth. We have witnesses. We have documentation of an attack on your property that led directly back to him." Ethan reached across the table and took Clara's hands. "Listen to me. Rhett is desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. He's already made several, admitting knowledge of the brick, hiring those men to burn your house, leaving a paper trail that connects him to Hartman. Each mistake is another nail in his coffin. But what if it's not enough? Then we make it enough. We walk into that courtroom with our heads high, and we tell the truth so clearly, so completely, that even a business-friendly judge can't ignore it." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice would prevail, that truth would win, that good people would be rewarded and bad people punished. But she'd lived 40 years in the real world, and she knew it didn't always work that way. Still, what choice did she have? Give up? Let Rhett win? Watch everything her father built fall into the hands of thieves and liars? No. She'd come too far to surrender now. Okay, Clara said, straightening her spine. Let's prepare. Let's gather everything we have and build a case so strong that even Rhett's expensive lawyers can't tear it down. They spent the next several hours organizing evidence into categories: financial fraud, witness testimony, physical threats, the attack. Tommy, Martinez, and Davis came to the house to give formal statements. Sarah drove out to help coordinate everything, her legal mind organizing chaos into coherent narrative. By noon, they had boxes full of documents, hours of recorded testimony, and a timeline that showed clearly and undeniably that Rhett Calder had been systematically looting the Whitaker Ranch for years. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. They loaded everything into Ethan's truck and made the drive to the county seat, arriving at the courthouse with 20 minutes to spare. The building was old red brick, imposing and official. Clara had been here once before for her father's will reading. That day felt like a lifetime ago. Sarah met them on the steps, her expression grim. Rhett's here. So are his lawyers, 3 of them from a firm in Houston. They look confident. So do we, Ethan said, though Clara wasn't sure she believed him. They entered the courthouse and made their way to the assigned courtroom. Rhett was already seated at the defendant's table with his legal team, 3 men in expensive suits who radiated calculated aggression. He didn't look at Clara as she entered, didn't acknowledge her existence, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. He was worried, no matter how confident his lawyers appeared. Judge Howard Brennan entered and everyone rose. He was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and a face that suggested he'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. He surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes, taking in the opposing parties, the stacks of evidence, the tension crackling in the air. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying authority. "This is an emergency hearing regarding allegations of fraud and misconduct at the Whitaker Ranch. I've reviewed the initial filings from both parties, and I have to say this is one of the most complex messes I've seen in my 30 years on the bench." No one spoke. Brennan continued, "We're going to proceed methodically. Each side will present their evidence and arguments. I will ask questions as needed, and at the end of this hearing I will make determinations regarding the emergency motions for asset freezes, injunctions, and protection orders. Is that clear?" Both sides indicated it was. "Good. Let's begin. Miss Whitaker, as the party who filed the emergency motions, you'll present first." Sarah Chen stood, gathered her materials, and began to speak. Her voice was clear and measured as she laid out the case: the missing money, the unpaid wages, the threats and violence. She presented bank statements showing discrepancies, contracts that didn't match deposits, testimony from Cowboys who'd been cheated. It was damning, thorough, undeniable. When Sarah finished, Judge Brennan turned to Rhett's lead attorney. "Mr. Jameson, your response?" Jameson stood, a man in his 50s with steel gray hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was smooth as oil. "Your Honor, what we have here is a tragic case of projection. Miss Whitaker, grief-stricken over her father's death and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of ranch management, has been embezzling funds for years. When my client, Mr. Calder, began to uncover this fraud, she turned the tables, fabricating evidence and making wild accusations to cover her own crimes. He began presenting his own evidence: bank statements showing transfers to accounts bearing Clara's name, purchase orders with signatures that looked like hers, a paper trail suggesting she'd been systematically stealing from the ranch she claimed to love. Clara's hands clenched into fists under the table. It was all lies, all fabricated, but it looked real, convincing, professional. Sarah objected repeatedly, pointing out inconsistencies and questioning the chain of custody for documents. But Jameson was good at his job, deflecting and redirecting with practiced ease. The hearing stretched on for hours. Witnesses were called, Cowboys testifying to unpaid wages, bank employees trying to explain discrepancies, even Sheriff Morrison reluctantly admitting to the connection between the attack and Hartman. Through it all, Judge Brennan listened with an inscrutable expression, taking notes, asking pointed questions of both sides. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade through the courtroom windows, Brennan called for a recess. "I need time to review all this evidence," he said. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for my ruling on the emergency motions. Until then, all parties are ordered to maintain the status quo. No transfers of property, no destruction of evidence, no contact between the principals except through legal counsel. Understood?" Everyone indicated they understood. Court was adjourned. Clara stood on shaking legs, feeling like she'd just survived a battle. Sarah came to her side immediately. "You did well," the lawyer said quietly. "Stayed calm, answered questions clearly. That matters." "But is it enough?" Clara asked. Sarah's pause was telling. "I don't know. Brennan's hard to read. He could go either way." They left the courthouse as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Clara felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. Ethan drove them back to the ranch in silence. When they arrived, the burned skeleton of the barn stood as a stark reminder of how much had already been lost. How much more could she afford to lose? That night, Clara dreamed of fire and falling, of everything she loved turning to ash in her hands. She woke gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, to find dawn breaking over the Texas horizon. Today, Judge Brennan would decide her fate. Today, she'd learn whether truth really did triumph over corruption. Today, she'd discover if 40 years of surviving had prepared her for the fight of her life. Clara stood before her bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., staring at her reflection with eyes that had seen too little sleep. The woman looking back was 40 years old, with lines etched around her mouth and eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. But there was something different in her expression now, something that hadn't been there a month ago. She wasn't broken anymore. Whatever Judge Brennan decided today, whatever happened in that courtroom, Clara knew she'd already won something important. She'd found her voice. She'd learned to fight. She'd discovered that survival and surrender weren't the same thing. That knowledge was worth more than any legal victory. She dressed carefully in the same navy dress she'd worn to her father's funeral. Simple, dignified, unadorned. The woman who'd buried her father 5 years ago had been lost and grieving, willing to sign away her inheritance just to make the lawyers stop talking. The woman putting on that dress today was someone else entirely. Ethan was already in the kitchen when she emerged, 2 cups of coffee waiting on the table. He looked as tired as she felt, but his eyes were alert, focused. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." They drove to the courthouse through morning fog that clung to the scrubland like ghosts. Neither spoke much. What was there to say? Everything that mattered would be said in front of Judge Brennan. Sarah Chen met them on the courthouse steps again, but this time her expression was different. There was excitement barely contained beneath her professional composure. "Something's happened," she said without preamble. "Something big." "What?" Clara felt her heart jump. One of the bank employees Rhett was working with, the account manager, Daniel Wu, he cracked. Showed up at the state attorney general's office at midnight with boxes of documents and a full confession. He's been recording conversations with Rhett for the past 6 months, keeping copies of every falsified document, maintaining his own parallel set of books showing the real numbers. Clara felt dizzy. Why would he do that? Insurance. He knew eventually this would all collapse, and he wanted to make sure he could cut a deal when it did. The AG's office has been working all night processing his evidence. They're sending a representative to the hearing this morning with everything Wu provided. "What does this mean?" Ethan asked. "It means we don't just have circumstantial evidence anymore. We have a co-conspirator turning state's evidence with documentary proof of everything. It's over, Clara. Rhett's done." Clara wanted to feel victorious. Instead, she just felt numb. After weeks of fear and fighting, after watching her barn burn and dodging bullets and living in constant terror, it seemed impossible that it could end with a banker's midnight confession. But Sarah's expression said it was real. This was actually happening. They entered the courtroom to find it more crowded than yesterday. Word had gotten out that something significant was breaking. Clara saw reporters in the back rows, saw townspeople she recognized, saw the curious and the concerned all gathered to witness what would happen to the Whitaker ranch. Rhett was already at the defendant's table, but his expensive lawyers weren't with him. Instead, he sat alone, his face gray and haggard. When Clara entered, he looked up, and their eyes met across the courtroom. There was no fight left in him, no arrogance, just the hollow stare of a man watching his empire crumble. Clara felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only a deep, bone-weary relief that it was finally over. Judge Brennan entered promptly at 9 a.m., and everyone rose. But before he could even sit, a side door opened and a woman in a crisp suit entered, carrying a briefcase. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm Assistant Attorney General Maria Delgado. I apologize for the interruption, but the state of Texas has information directly relevant to these proceedings." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "Approach." Delgado and Sarah both moved to the bench for a whispered conference. Clara watched, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as papers were exchanged and examined. Brennan's expression grew darker with each page he read. Finally, he looked up at Rhett. "Mr. Calder, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I suggest you think very carefully before answering. Did you, either directly or through intermediaries, engage in systematic fraud against the Whitaker Ranch?" Rhett's lawyer, a public defender who'd been assigned when his Houston attorneys mysteriously withdrew that morning, stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." "Noted." Brennan turned to Delgado. "Counselor, what exactly has the state uncovered?" Delgado spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Your Honor, we have evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving Mr. Calder, 3 employees of Horizon National Bank, and cattle broker Gerald Hartman to systematically embezzle funds from the Whitaker Ranch. Over a 4-year period, they stole approximately $2.3 million through falsified cattle sales, inflated supply costs, and wage theft. We also have evidence linking Mr. Calder to arson, assault, and attempted murder." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Clara felt Ethan's hand find hers under the table, his grip steady and reassuring. Brennan looked at Rhett with something approaching disgust. "Mr. Calder, you understand that criminal charges will be filed separately from these civil proceedings?" Rhett didn't answer, just sat there, staring at nothing. "Very well." Brennan shuffled through the papers before him, then looked directly at Clara. "Miss Whitaker, I owe you an apology. When I reviewed the initial filings, I was skeptical of your claims. The scope of the alleged fraud seemed too extensive, too elaborate, but the evidence presented by the Attorney General's office confirms everything you've been saying." He turned to Sarah. "Counselor Chen, your emergency motions are granted in full. All accounts connected to the ranch are frozen pending further investigation. Mr. Calder is hereby enjoined from any contact with Miss Whitaker or any ranch employees, and I'm issuing a protection order that extends to everyone involved in bringing this fraud to light." Sarah stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. We'd also like to address the ownership structure of the ranch. As you know, the property currently belongs to High Point Holdings, LLC. Brennan nodded. "I've reviewed those documents. Mr. Cross, would you stand, please?" Ethan rose, his expression carefully neutral. "You purchased the ranch's debt to prevent foreclosure, is that correct?" Brennan asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And what are your intentions regarding the property now?" Ethan glanced at Clara, something unreadable in his pale eyes. Then he turned back to the judge. "I'd like to transfer ownership to Miss Whitaker, Your Honor. The ranch should belong to James Whitaker's daughter. It's what he would have wanted." The courtroom went silent. Clara felt her breath catch, felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd been fighting to save the ranch, fighting to expose Rhett, fighting for justice. But she'd accepted that legally. The ranch belonged to Ethan now. She'd never expected him to give it back. Brennan studied Ethan carefully. "That's a very generous gesture, Mr. Cross. You understand you'd be giving up a property worth several $1,000,000? "I understand, but some debts can't be measured in money. James Whitaker gave me a chance when I needed it most. This is me paying that debt forward to his daughter." "Miss Whitaker," Brennan turned to Clara, "do you accept this transfer?" Clara couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Let the record show Miss Whitaker accepts," Brennan said. "I'll order the transfer to be executed immediately, pending the resolution of the criminal investigation." He paused, then added, "Miss Whitaker, your father would be proud of you. You've shown extraordinary courage in fighting for what's right." Clara wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by emotion. After 5 years of loss and 3 years of systematic abuse, After watching everything crumble and burn, she was getting her father's ranch back. Not as a charity case, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who'd fought for it and earned it and refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Brennan addressed the courtroom. As for Mr. Calder, you are remanded into custody pending criminal proceedings. Sheriff Morrison, take him into custody. Morrison, who'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom, stood and moved forward with obvious reluctance. He placed handcuffs on Rhett, read him his rights in a voice that shook slightly. Clara watched Rhett being led away and felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication, no satisfaction, just emptiness where fear and anger had lived for so long. The hearing concluded quickly after that. Brennan set dates for follow-up proceedings to address the recovered funds and determine restitution for the unpaid wages. Delgado indicated the state would be filing criminal charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy. And then it was over. Clara walked out of the courthouse into bright morning sunshine, Ethan and Sarah on either side of her. Reporters called out questions, but Sarah waved them off with practiced efficiency. Not today. Miss Whitaker will issue a statement when she's ready. They made it to Ethan's truck and climbed inside. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They just sat there, breathing, processing, trying to believe it was real. You didn't have to do that, Clara said finally, looking at Ethan. Give me the ranch. You could have kept it, and I would have understood. I know, but that was never what this was about. Then what was it about? Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring out at the courthouse. Your father told me once that land has memory, that it remembers the people who loved it. This land remembers him, Clara. And it should remember you too. Not as someone who lost it and had it given back out of charity, but as someone who fought for it when everyone said fighting was pointless. Clara felt fresh tears threatening. I don't know how to thank you. You already did. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. You trusted me when you had every reason not to. You fought for those Cowboys and for your father's legacy and for yourself. He turned to look at her, and there was warmth in those pale eyes. That's all the thanks I need. Sarah cleared her throat. As touching as this is, we have practical matters to discuss. The state will be recovering what funds they can from the conspiracy participants. Most of it's probably gone, but we should be able to get some restitution. In the meantime, the ranch is yours, but it's still heavily in debt. How much debt? Clara asked. Sarah consulted her notes. After the fraud is accounted for, maybe $300,000. That's assuming we can prove the debt was inflated by Rhett's theft, which we can. It's manageable, Clara. Especially once the recovered funds come through and you can sell off some assets if needed. $300,000 instead of $2 million, manageable instead of impossible. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. What about the Cowboys? She asked. The wages they're owed? That'll be part of the restitution. The state will make sure they're paid, even if it means seizing Rhett's personal assets. It might take time, but they'll get what they're owed. Clara nodded, then turned to Ethan. I want to offer you a partnership, equal ownership of the ranch. You saved it, and you should share in it. Ethan smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face. How about this? I'll take a consulting fee for helping expose the fraud. You use that money to pay down the debt. The ranch is yours, Clara. Build something good with it. It was more generosity than Clara could process, more kindness than she knew how to accept. But she was learning to let people help her, learning that accepting support wasn't the same as admitting weakness. Okay, she said, thank you for everything. They drove back to the ranch, and as they turned onto the long driveway, Clara saw the Cowboys gathered in front of the house. Tommy, Martinez, Davis, and a dozen others, all waiting. When the truck stopped, they approached, their faces uncertain. Clara climbed out, and Tommy stepped forward. Miss Clara, we heard what happened in court. Is it true? You got the ranch back? It's true. A cheer went up from the assembled men. Tommy swept Clara into a hug that lifted her off her feet, and then she was being passed from hand to hand, embraced by rough men with callous palms and genuine joy in their eyes. We're going to rebuild, Clara said when they finally set her down. The barn, the operation, all of it. And you'll all get the wages you're owed, every penny. I promise you that. We never doubted you'd come through, Martinez said, his weathered face creased with a smile. Your father raised you right. The words hit harder than any legal victory. These men had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself, had stood with her when standing with her meant risking everything. They'd given her the courage to fight back. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. All of you, for not giving up on this ranch, for not giving up on me. You're a Whitaker, Tommy said simply. That means something around here. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and planning. Sarah worked with the AG's office to coordinate the transfer of ownership. Ethan helped Clara start making lists of what needed to be done. Debts to prioritize, repairs to schedule, operations to restart. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in years, it was the good kind of overwhelming, the kind that came from having possibilities instead of just problems. That evening, as the sun began to set, Clara walked out to the burned ruins of the barn. She stood there looking at the blackened timbers, the twisted metal, the ash that drifted in the light breeze. So much had been destroyed, so much lost. But standing there, Clara didn't see destruction. She saw opportunity, a chance to rebuild something better, a chance to honor her father's memory by creating something worthy of the Whitaker name. Ethan found her there as the sky turned gold and crimson. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I am actually. Clara turned to him. We're going to rebuild the barn, make it bigger, better. Solar panels on the roof, modern stalls, proper ventilation, everything my father would have wanted but couldn't afford. Sounds expensive. It will be, but we'll make it work. That's what Whitakers do. We make it work. Ethan smiled. Yes, you do. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The land stretched out in all directions, marked by fence lines her father had built, and memories that would never fade. This was home. This was legacy. This was worth fighting for. Over the following weeks, the pieces fell into place with surprising speed. The state's investigation uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy. Rhett, the bank employees, Hartman, and 2 cattle brokers who'd been helping falsify sale records. All of them were arrested and charged. All of them would face justice. Daniel Wu, the bank employee who'd turned state's evidence, cut a deal for reduced charges in exchange for his testimony. The others weren't so fortunate. Rhett himself was looking at 20 years minimum. Sheriff Morrison quietly announced his retirement, citing health concerns. Everyone knew the real reason. He'd looked the other way too many times, protected the wrong people, failed in his duty. The county elected a new sheriff, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd built her reputation on refusing to be bought or intimidated. One of her first acts was to personally apologize to Clara for Morrison's failures. The recovered funds started coming in. Not all of it. Much had been spent or hidden too well to trace, but enough to pay the Cowboys their back wages and make a significant dent in the ranch's debt. Clara stood in the ranch office and handed out checks to each man personally, looking them in the eye and thanking them for their loyalty. More than one of them left with tears in their eyes. With the immediate crisis resolved, Clara turned her attention to rebuilding. She hired a contractor to design the new barn, worked with an architect to make sure it would be both functional and beautiful. She upgraded equipment, invested in better fencing, brought in a veterinarian to ensure the cattle were healthy. She also hired a business manager, a sharp young woman named Patricia Reeves, Tommy's younger sister, who had an accounting degree and a fierce determination to prove herself. Patricia went through the books with forensic precision, creating systems to ensure nothing like Rhett's theft could ever happen again. And she hired Ethan. Not as a ranch hand, though he still worked cattle when needed, but as head of security and operations, using his particular skills to make sure the ranch was protected from future threats. He accepted the position with the understanding that it was temporary, just until Clara felt fully confident running things herself. But as months passed and spring turned to summer, temporary started feeling more permanent. Clara would catch herself watching Ethan work with the horses, his quiet competence and careful strength so reminiscent of her father. She'd find herself looking for him when she had news to share or problems to solve. She'd notice the way the house felt emptier on the rare nights he was away. She wasn't sure when partnership had shifted into something else, something deeper. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch after a long day of work, watching the new barn take shape against the sunset. It was nearly complete, a beautiful structure of wood and steel and glass that honored the past while embracing the future. My father would have loved it, Clara said quietly. Yeah, he would have. I wish he could have seen this, seen the ranch recovered, the truth exposed, justice served. He knows, Ethan said. Wherever he is, he knows, and he's proud. Clara turned to look at him. Do you ever think about staying? Not just until things are stable, but staying? Ethan met her gaze, and something shifted in his expression. I think about it. Every day, actually. And? And I keep coming back to the same question. Am I staying because the ranch needs me or because I need it? Does it matter? It might. I don't want to be another person who takes from you, Clara, even if what I'm taking is a place to belong. Clara reached over and took his hand. You're not taking anything. You're building something with me. That's different. They sat like that as the sun sank lower, hands clasped, the future spreading out before them, full of possibility and promise. The new barn was completed in early July. Clara organized a celebration, a barn-raising party like the ones her father used to throw, back when the ranch was prosperous and the community was strong. She invited everyone, the Cowboys, the townspeople, even Sarah Chen and representatives from the AG's office who'd helped bring down Rhett's conspiracy. Over 100 people showed up. They filled the new barn with laughter and music, with stories about James Whitaker and toasts to his daughter's courage. Clara moved through the crowd in a daze, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. These were people who remembered the old Whitaker ranch, who'd watched it decline, who'd seen Clara fighting to save it, and now they were celebrating its resurrection. Tommy's band played country music while people danced on the new wooden floor. Martinez manned the barbecue, cooking enough brisket to feed an army. Patricia kept the books on who donated what to the rebuilding fund, tracking every dollar with characteristic precision. And Ethan stayed close to Clara's side, his presence steady and grounding through it all. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Clara found herself alone in the barn with Ethan. The lanterns cast warm light across the new timbers, making everything glow gold. Thank you, Clara said, for all of this. For saving the ranch, for saving me. I didn't save you. You saved yourself. You gave me the tools to do it. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what that felt like. Ethan stepped closer, and Clara felt her breath catch. And, Clara, I need to tell you something. I came back here because I owed your father a debt. That's true. But I'm staying because of you. Because somewhere along the way, fighting beside you, watching you find your strength, I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. I'm 40 years old, she said. I've spent half my life alone, convinced that was all I deserved. That love was for other people, not for women like me. Women like you? Women who are too tired, too damaged, too ordinary to be worth loving. Ethan cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. Clara Whitaker, you are the least ordinary person I've ever met. You're fierce and brave and stubborn as hell. You're everything I admire and everything I want. If you'll have me, I'd like to build a life here with you. Not as the man who saved your ranch, but as your partner. Your equal. Your everything. Clara kissed him, pouring 5 years of grief and 3 years of fear and 40 years of loneliness into that single moment. Ethan kissed her back with a tenderness that made her feel cherished and seen and wholly herself. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Clara laughed through her tears. Yes, she said, yes to all of it. Yes to building something together. Yes to partnership. Yes to you. They stood in the barn her father had dreamed of, surrounded by the ghosts of memory and the promise of tomorrow, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Complete. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She and Ethan ran the ranch together, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Clara handled the day-to-day operations, the finances, the relationship with the hands. Ethan managed security, maintenance, and the larger strategic decisions about where to invest and how to grow. They were partners in every sense of the word. The ranch prospered under their joint leadership. Cattle sales hit record highs. They diversified into sustainable ranching practices that attracted premium buyers. They hired more hands, paid fair wages, created a workplace where people wanted to stay. And slowly, the Whitaker Ranch became known again, not as a cautionary tale of decline, but as a success story, as proof that integrity and hard work still mattered, as evidence that sometimes the good guys actually won. Rhett Calder was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The bank employees got shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Hartman fled before his trial, but was apprehended in Mexico and extradited back to face justice. Clara attended Rhett's sentencing, sitting in the gallery and watching him be led away in chains. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep, abiding relief that he could never hurt anyone again. As she left the courthouse that day, a reporter approached her. "Miss Whitaker, you've become something of a symbol for fighting back against corruption. What would you say to other people facing similar situations?" Clara thought about it, choosing her words carefully. "I'd say don't give up. Don't let people convince you that you're too small or too weak or too insignificant to matter. I'm just a ranch cook who got tired of being pushed around. If I can stand up to powerful men and win, anyone can. It takes courage. It takes support. But most of all, it takes refusing to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be." The interview ran in papers across Texas. Clara received letters from all over the state, from other ranch owners dealing with fraud, from women facing down abusive partners, from ordinary people who'd been inspired by her story. She answered everyone personally, offering what advice she could, sharing what she'd learned about fighting and surviving and ultimately prevailing. 2 years after the barn burning, Clara and Ethan were married in a simple ceremony on the ranch. Tommy gave Clara away, walking her down an aisle formed by the Cowboys who'd stood by her through everything. Sarah Chen officiated, her voice strong and clear as she spoke about partnership and courage and love that's earned through shared struggle. Clara wore a simple white dress and her mother's pearls. Ethan wore a suit that he was clearly uncomfortable in, but his eyes, when he looked at Clara, held such depth of feeling that she felt her breath catch. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises about partnership and equality, about building something lasting, about honoring the past while creating the future. When Ethan kissed her as her husband for the first time, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers loud enough to be heard across 3 counties. The celebration lasted until dawn, full of dancing and laughter and joy. Clara moved through it all in a daze of happiness, hardly able to believe this was her life now. She was 42 years old. She owned the ranch her father had built. She had a partner who respected her strength and challenged her to be better. She had work that mattered, and people who depended on her, and a future that stretched out full of possibility. She'd survived. But more than that, she'd triumphed. Late that night, after the last guest had departed and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands, Clara and Ethan stood together looking out over the land. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked. "About my father. About how he always said this land would outlive us all. That it would remember the people who loved it. He was right. I want to create something that honors that, a legacy that goes beyond just us." Clara turned to face him. "What would you think about turning part of the ranch into a training program? For young people who want to learn sustainable ranching, who want to work the land but don't have the capital to start their own operations. We could teach them everything: cattle management, land stewardship, business practices. Give them the kind of chance your father gave you." Ethan's face lit up with understanding. The Whitaker Ranch Fellowship trained the next generation of ranchers. Exactly. Keep the knowledge alive. Keep the values alive. Make sure what we've built here doesn't die with us. Your father would love that. I know. That's why I want to do it. They began planning the fellowship program that very night, sketching ideas and possibilities, already excited about the future. Over the next year, they formalized the program, secured grants, recruited mentors from among the experienced hands. The first class of Whitaker Fellows arrived in the spring, 8 young people from diverse backgrounds, all hungry to learn, all committed to building better futures in agriculture. Clara threw herself into teaching them everything her father had taught her, passing down 42 years of accumulated wisdom. Watching them work the land, seeing their excitement and dedication, Clara felt her father's presence more strongly than she had in years. This was his dream, extended and amplified. This was his legacy, living and growing and touching lives he'd never meet. One evening, after a long day of working with the fellows, Clara returned to the house she now shared with Ethan. She found him on the porch, reading through applications for the next year's fellowship class. "We got 63 applications," he said, looking up as she approached. "We can only take 10. "Then we'll pick the best 10, the ones who remind us why we started this." Clara sank into the chair beside him, accepting the glass of lemonade he'd poured for her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had witnessed so much pain and triumph, loss and recovery. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Ethan asked. "Before all this? When things were simpler?" Clara considered the question seriously. "No. That life was small. I was surviving, not living. I was going through motions without purpose, accepting things I should have fought against. This life is harder, but it's mine. I chose it. I fought for it. That makes all the difference." "No regrets?" "None. Well, maybe one." "What's that?" "I wish I'd found my courage sooner. Wish I hadn't wasted so many years being afraid." Ethan reached over and took her hand. "You weren't wasting years. You were learning, building the strength you'd need when the time came to fight. Everything happens when it's supposed to." Clara wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the sentiment. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, talking about the fellowship program, about the ranch's future, about the small joys and large satisfactions of a life well lived. And Clara felt a peace she'd never known was possible. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. 5 years after the barn burning, the Whitaker Ranch was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The cattle operation was profitable and sustainable. The fellowship program had graduated 42 students, many of whom had gone on to start their own ranching operations or to bring new practices to family lands. The ranch employed 26 people full-time, all earning fair wages and benefits. And Clara herself had become something she'd never imagined: a leader, a mentor, a voice for integrity in agricultural business. She spoke at conferences about fighting fraud. She consulted with other ranchers facing similar challenges. She testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections for family ranches and agricultural workers. At 47, Clara Whitaker had found her purpose, and it was bigger than she'd ever dreamed. One spring morning, she woke before dawn, as always, but instead of heading straight to work, she found herself drawn to the small cemetery on the edge of the property where her parents were buried. She stood before her father's headstone, reading the familiar inscription: "James Whitaker, beloved father and rancher, the land remembers." "Hey, Dad," Clara said quietly. "I know it's been a while since I visited. Been busy, which I think you'd understand." The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of mesquite and cattle and good Texas earth. "I wanted to tell you that we did it. We saved the ranch. Not just saved it, made it better, stronger. Exactly what you always dreamed it could be. And we're passing on what you taught us, making sure the next generation knows how to do this right." Clara felt tears on her cheeks, but didn't wipe them away. "I wish you could have met Ethan as the man he became. Wish you could see what your kindness to a scared kid turned into. He's a good man, Dad. The kind you'd be proud to call family. We're building something together that's going to outlast us both." She touched the headstone, feeling the warm granite beneath her palm. "I'm not that lost girl anymore. The one who signed away her inheritance because she was too scared to fight. I'm strong now, fierce even. I learned how to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. You'd be proud of who I've become." The sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day beginning, another chance to build something good. "I miss you," Clara whispered, "every single day. But I'm okay now. Better than okay. I'm living the life you wanted for me, fighting for things that matter, making a difference." She stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house, toward Ethan, who'd be waking soon, toward the ranch hands who'd be arriving for breakfast, toward another day of hard work and honest purpose. As Clara crossed the threshold into her kitchen, her domain, her sanctuary, she felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, a blessing, an acknowledgement, a quiet affirmation that she'd done what he'd asked. She'd fought for the land. She'd refused to let anyone take it from her. She'd honored his legacy by creating one of her own. The ranch would outlive her, just as it had outlived him, but it would remember them both. Remember the blood and sweat and love they'd poured into this soil. Remember the stand they'd made against corruption and greed. Remember that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys actually won. Clara Whitaker was 47 years old, and she'd spent half her life holding together a dying ranch. But the ranch wasn't dying anymore. It was thriving, growing, becoming something bigger and better than even James Whitaker had dreamed. And Clara, the woman who'd been dismissed as just the cook, stood at the center of it all, no longer surviving but truly living, her legacy stretching out before her like the endless Texas sky. She'd reclaimed more than her father's land. She'd reclaimed herself. And that, more than any legal victory or financial recovery, was the real triumph. Clara stood at her stove, preparing breakfast for the people who depended on her, and smiled, the same task she'd been doing for 25 years. But everything had changed. She had changed. And in the golden light of a Texas morning, with her whole life spread out before her full of purpose and possibility and hard-won peace, Clara Whitaker finally understood what her father had meant. The land remembers. And now, it would remember her too. Not as a victim, not as someone who needed saving, but as a fighter, a survivor, a woman who'd taken back everything that was stolen and built something beautiful from the ashes. The Whitaker Ranch would endure, and so would she.